Hey hey. Welcome back to The Fiction Wizard. We've got something fire today. Augusta Longbottom brought healer to Hogwarts. Medical scan ended Dumbledore's career. Likes and subs keep us going. Alright, story time. Chapter 1. The scan. The letter from Hogwarts arrived on a Tuesday, which Augusta Longbottom had always considered an unremarkable day for remarkable things. She read it standing at the kitchen window, one hand wrapped around her morning tea, while Neville sat at the table behind her pushing scrambled eggs around his plate in the slow, spiraling pattern of a boy who had something on his mind. Hogwarts, she said, not turning around. Yeah. He looked up. I got in then. You got in then. She set the letter on the windowsill and finally turned to look at him, 11 years old now, round-faced and earnest, with his father's jaw and his mother's eyes and something entirely his own in the cautious way he held himself, like a person who had learned early that surprises were usually bad. Did you doubt it? Neville shrugged, which was its own kind of answer. Augusta set her tea down. She pulled out the chair across from him, which she rarely did. She was not, by nature or practice, a woman who sat to have conversations she could have standing, and she looked at her grandson steadily until he stopped pushing his eggs. You are a Longbottom, she said. Your father was one of the finest orators this country produced. Your mother had a gift for charms that made grown men feel inadequate. You were always going to Hogwarts, Neville. That was never in question. He nodded, but the nod had a quality she didn't like. It was the nod of someone who agreed because arguing seemed worse than believing. She let it go. She had learned, across 11 years of raising a child she'd never planned to raise, that some conversations needed a better foundation than a Tuesday morning. She picked up her tea again, turned back to the window, and watched the garden in the early light while Neville quietly ate his eggs. But she kept the letter. And that evening, after Neville had gone to bed and the house was quiet in the way old houses get quiet, full of small sounds, creaks and settling and the distant conversation of owls, she sat in the armchair by the fire and read it again. 3 times. Then she opened the drawer in the side table where she kept things she wasn't ready to throw away, and she pulled out a different letter. This one was 18 months old and written on ministry parchment, and it was from a junior healer at St. Mungo's who had treated Neville after a bout of accidental magic that had, briefly and inexplicably, failed. The letter had said, in the careful, hedging language of someone who didn't want to cause alarm, Neville's magical output during the incident was consistent with a child of significantly younger developmental age. This may be natural variance. However, if the pattern persists, a formal core assessment might be advisable. Augusta had read that letter 7 times when it arrived. She had put it in the drawer. She had told herself it was natural variance. She was done telling herself things. She old Miriam Strout the next morning. Miriam Strout was not, technically, the most famous healer in Britain. That title belonged to a man named Cresswell who had developed a treatment for dragon pox and had a portrait of himself in St. Mungo's lobby to prove it. But Miriam Strout was widely regarded, among the people who actually knew things about magical medicine, as the best diagnostic healer alive. She had an almost supernatural gift for reading magical cores, for the fine, precise work of assessment and measurement that most healers considered secondary to the flashier business of treatment. She had also, Augusta happened to know, been Alice Longbottom's healer during Alice's last coherent year. That mattered. Augusta chose her people carefully. The reply came that afternoon, written in Strout's characteristic no-nonsense hand, Thursday. 10 o'clock. I'll bring the full array. Don't tell the boy too much beforehand, I want baseline stress levels. Augusta read it, folded it precisely, and sent the reply, agreed. He won't know until Thursday morning. She spent Wednesday in a state of careful calm that fooled no one, least of all herself. She helped Neville with his school list. They went to Diagon Alley, got his wand from Ollivander's after an uncharacteristically lengthy session that left the old wand maker looking thoughtful and slightly unsettled, bought his books and his robes and a toad named Trevor who immediately escaped and was retrieved from beneath a display of self-stirring cauldrons, and she did not let herself think about what Thursday might tell her. Or what it might confirm. Ollivander's behavior nagged at her, though. He had gone through 11 wands before he reached the one that worked, a 9-inch chestnut with a unicorn hair core, and even then his expression had been the expression of a man who had found a solution but wasn't sure it was the right one. She had watched him hand it to Neville, watched the wand send out a shower of sparks, and say nothing except the price. She'd wanted to grab him by the collar and ask what, exactly, he was thinking. She hadn't. It was Wednesday, and Thursday was coming, and she was picking her battles in order of importance. Thursday arrived grey and damp, the kind of late July morning that remembered it was Britain. Strout appeared at the front gate at exactly 10 o'clock, which Augusta appreciated as a baseline statement of professional respect. She was a compact woman in her late 50s, dark-skinned with close-cropped silver hair, carrying a healer's bag that was considerably larger on the inside than the outside. She wore lime-green healer's robes under a sensible waterproof cloak and had the expression of someone who had already had 2 coffees and was prepared for a third. Augusta. She clasped her hand at the gate. Not a handshake exactly, more a grip. Miriam. Thank you for coming. You said full core assessment, so I brought the full array. She patted the bag. Where's the boy? Kitchen. He knows he's being examined, I told him this morning. He knows you're a healer. I didn't tell him why. What did you tell him? That I wanted him checked over before school started. He accepted it. Augusta paused. He's an accepting child. Something in her voice must have given something away, because Strout looked at her with a sudden attentiveness that had nothing to do with professional courtesy and everything to do with the way certain people look at you when they recognize grief being held at arm's length. How long have you suspected something? Strout asked. 1.5 years. Formally. Augusta held the gate open. Informally? Since he was 4. Strout walked through the gate and said nothing, which was the correct response. Neville was sitting at the kitchen table with Trevor the toad in a glass tank beside him, trying and failing to look unconcerned. He'd clearly dressed deliberately, clean jumper, hair attempted, and the effort of it made Augusta's chest tighten in a way she didn't allow onto her face. You must be Neville, Strout said, setting her bag on the counter and beginning to unpack with the brisk efficiency of someone doing something she'd done several hundred times. I'm Healer Strout. I worked with your mum, once upon a time. She was brilliant. Neville went very still in the way he always did when someone mentioned his parents unexpectedly. Then he said, quietly, Gran says that too. Gran's right. Now. Strout turned with a series of instruments in her hands, a crystal diagnostic sphere, 2 sets of measuring rods that emitted a faint hum, several sheets of a paper-like substance that Augusta didn't recognize, and what appeared to be a compass that had decided to measure things other than direction. I'm going to do a full core assessment. Do you know what that means? Not really, Neville admitted. Every witch or wizard has a magical core, it's the part of you that generates and processes magic. It's not a physical thing, exactly, more like imagine a river. Some rivers are wide, some are narrow, some flow fast and some slow, and sometimes there are things in the river that don't belong there. Rocks, debris. This, she held up the crystal sphere, is how I look at the river. It doesn't hurt. It's a bit warm, sometimes. You might feel a tingling. That's all. She paused. Any questions? Neville glanced at Augusta. She gave him a small nod. No, he said. Okay. What do I do? Sit exactly where you are and try to be comfortable. Don't try to do magic or stop magic. Just exist. That's all I need from you. She began. Augusta stood by the window and watched, and she kept her face entirely neutral, and her hands, which she had folded behind her back, pressed against each other hard enough to whiten her knuckles. The diagnostic process took nearly 20 minutes, which was already telling. Standard core assessments took 8 to 10 for a child Neville's age. Strout moved around the kitchen in a careful circuit, taking readings from different angles, occasionally making notes on those paper-like sheets, occasionally pausing with the crystal sphere held at a very precise distance from Neville's sternum and her eyes doing something that wasn't quite squinting and wasn't quite wide. It was the focused look of someone reading small print in a language they knew very well. Neville sat. He breathed. Trevor bumped against the side of the tank. Then Strout stopped. She stood very still, sphere in one hand, and stared at something Augusta couldn't see. "Neville," she said carefully, "I'm going to ask you to do something. I want you to try to cast a spell, any spell, something simple, something you've practiced. Don't worry about whether it works. Just try." Neville reached into his pocket and produced his wand, the chestnut, 9 inches, unicorn hair. He pointed it at the salt shaker on the counter. Wingardium Leviosa. The salt shaker trembled. Lifted perhaps an inch. Wobbled. Dropped. Neville lowered his wand with the expression of someone confirming something they'd already expected. Strout watched the sphere the entire time. Then she set it down on the counter, very gently, and turned to Augusta. "Can we?" She glanced at Neville, back at Augusta. "Neville," Augusta said, "why don't you go introduce Trevor to the garden? He could do with the air." He knew he was being got rid of, and the knowing was written clearly on his face, but he picked up the tank and went, because he was, as Augusta had told Strout, an accepting child. The back door closed behind him. The kitchen was suddenly very quiet. "Tell me," Augusta said. Strout picked up the diagnostic sheets, looked at them once more as if she was giving herself one final chance to be wrong, and then laid them on the table in front of Augusta. "His core is suppressed," she said. "Not underdeveloped. Not naturally weak. Suppressed. There's a binding on it, a series of bindings, actually, layered. Whoever did this was careful. They were trying to make it look organic." Augusta looked at the sheets. They meant nothing to her visually, she wasn't a healer, but the numbers and patterns in the margins were clearly significant because Strout was looking at them the way professional people look at things that keep them up at night. "How suppressed?" Augusta asked. "He should be significantly more powerful than what he's demonstrating. The core output I'm reading as the suppressed baseline, what's getting through the binding, represents perhaps 30 to 40% of what's actually there." She paused to let that land. "What I'm seeing in the underlying structure suggests his core is large. Not unusually so, but well above average. He's not a weak magical, Augusta. He never was. Someone with very sophisticated knowledge of core magic, has been limiting what he can do." Augusta sat down. She had not planned to sit down. Her legs made the decision independently. "When," she said. "The bindings are old. The earliest layer goes back at least 8, 9 years, he would have been 2, 3 years old." Strout's voice was level, but her jaw was doing something tight and controlled. "There are at least 3 distinct layers. The oldest is the deepest. The more recent ones look like maintenance. Like someone refreshing the original work periodically." "Periodically," Augusta repeated. "How periodically?" "The most recent layer is less than 2 years old." Strout held her gaze. "Someone has been close enough to him to reapply this within the last 2 years." The garden sounds drifted through the closed door, the distant creak of the gate, a frog noise from Trevor's direction, a robin that had no opinion on any of this. "Can you tell," Augusta said, very carefully, "whose work it is?" Strout was quiet for a moment. "I can't tell you a name. That's not what a diagnostic reads. But I can tell you the technique, the style of the binding. It's extremely unusual. Almost no one in Britain uses this method anymore because it requires a level of power and precision that most practitioners don't have. She paused. I've seen this signature once before. In the archived records from the war years. There were cases, a handful of cases, of Death Eaters who'd been subjected to magical binding by ministry order, restricting dangerous individuals. But the technique was developed by someone specific, Augusta said. It was not a question. Strout didn't answer immediately. Miriam, Augusta said, with a patience she had refined over 30 years of being the kind of woman who got answers eventually. Whose technique is this? Strout folded her hands on the table. The binding methodology most closely matches published work and known application patterns associated with. She stopped. Started again. This is not evidence. I want you to understand this is a professional assessment, not an accusation. Diagnostic readings are indicators, not proof. What I'm saying is that this most closely resembles, say it, Augusta said quietly. Albus Dumbledore. The kitchen clock ticked. Augusta's face did nothing. Her hands, in her lap, folded over each other very precisely. How certain are you, she said. Of the suppression itself? Completely. There is a deliberate magical binding on your grandson's core. I will put my career behind that finding. Strout's voice was steady. Of the attribution? I can't sign that in a report. Not without corroboration. But the stylistic markers of the binding methodology, the specific charm architecture, the layering pattern, these are identifiable. Magical technique is like handwriting. And this handwriting is. She looked at Augusta directly. It's not like Dumbledore's. It is Dumbledore's. Another silence. What do I do, Augusta said, to get that into a report? Strout opened her bag and pulled out a fresh sheet of the diagnostic paper. I file the full assessment with St. Mungo's as a mandatory reporting case. Any evidence of deliberate magical interference with a child's core requires mandatory DMLE notification. I can't suppress the finding, Augusta. The moment I complete and file this assessment, it goes to the Department of Magical Law Enforcement automatically. I know, Augusta said. This will not be quiet. This will not be, I know. Augusta looked at her. File it. Strout looked back at her for a moment. Then she picked up her quill. Augusta opened the back door and stood in the doorway. Neville was crouched at the far end of the garden where the lawn met the vegetable beds, watching Trevor navigate a patch of wet grass with the focused attention of someone who found toads genuinely fascinating and had no idea that everything had just changed. He looked up when he heard the door. Is everything all right? Everything is fine, Augusta said, and it was not a lie. Everything was clarified, which was not the same as fine but was a necessary first step. Come inside. Healer Strout has a few more things she'd like to ask you about. He picked up Trevor and came toward her, the toad cradled carefully in both hands, and Augusta watched him walk across the garden in the gray July light and thought, with a clarity she hadn't felt in years, that she was going to take this world apart, methodically and without remorse, until she found every stone that had been placed on her grandson's path and threw it at the person responsible. The thought was very calm. That was how she knew it was real. Inside, Strout asked Neville about his magical history, first incidents of accidental magic, frequency, the kinds of spells he'd found easier and harder. She asked in a conversational way that was clearly practiced and produced answers Neville gave without any sense that he was revealing anything significant. He talked about his first year at primary school, when he'd made every plant in the classroom grow 6 inches in about 30 seconds because someone had called him stupid and he'd been upset. He talked about a birthday party where he'd accidentally turned all the balloons orange because he'd wanted them to be blue. He talked about how, since then, his magic had felt, he struggled for the word, thin, was what he said eventually. Like trying to hear something through walls. Strout made notes. Her expression gave nothing away, which was a professional skill Augusta recognized and respected. Neville talked about the time he'd fallen from the roof of his uncle's house and bounced, genuinely bounced, like a rubber ball, and the way the magic that had saved him had felt enormous and effortless. Like the walls weren't there for a second. When exactly was that? Strout asked. Neville thought. I was 7, I think. Gran was away. Strout looked up from her notes and held Augusta's gaze for a fraction of a second. Gran was away. When Augusta wasn't there, the maintenance couldn't be performed. For a moment, a single unguarded moment, the binding had loosened. Augusta put her hand on the windowsill because the edge of something was rising in her that she couldn't afford in this room, in front of her grandson, in front of anyone. You're very observant, Strout told Neville, in a tone that was specifically warm in the way very professional people get specifically warm when they want a child to feel genuinely seen. That's not a small thing. A lot of people never notice what their magic actually feels like. You've paid attention to yourself. Neville looked faintly surprised, like a compliment had arrived from an unexpected direction. You'll do well at Hogwarts, Strout said. Not soothingly, flatly, as a statement of fact, which was more convincing. I mean that. She left at 12:30, bag repacked, the diagnostic sheets in a sealed folder, the assessment half completed, the portions that could be done without back reference to St. Mungo's records were drafted. She would file the full report by end of business. At the gate she gripped Augusta's arm once, briefly, and said, I know what Alice meant to you. I know what Frank meant to you. This is connected, Augusta. I don't know how. But I've looked at enough damage to recognize when things haven't just happened, when they've been arranged. Augusta looked at her. File the report, she said. And then keep your head down. Strout made a noise that suggested she had never kept her head down in her professional life and wasn't going to start now, and walked to the apparition point at the end of the lane. Augusta watched her go, then went back inside and spent 20 minutes on the landing outside Neville's room, listening to him talk to Trevor in the low, comfortable murmur of someone who'd found genuine companionship in an amphibian, before she went downstairs and made lunch. That afternoon she wrote 4 letters. The first was to Griselda Marchbanks, who had examined both Dumbledore and Voldemort in their OWLS and had no reverence for either of them and an extremely long memory. The second was to Tiberius Ogden, who sat on the Wisengamot and whose family had been on the right side of enough historical arguments that his instincts were reliable. The third was to a solicitor named Croker, no relation to the unspeakable, who had handled 3 of the most significant magical malpractice cases in the last 20 years with a record of 2 complete victories and 1 settlement so large it had reshaped the compensation landscape. The 4th letter she stared at for a long time before she wrote it. It was the shortest. It was to Amelia Bones, head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, and it said only, Miriam Strout will file a mandatory DMLE report this afternoon regarding my grandson. The finding is significant. I am asking that you handle this personally and that the investigation not be delegated. I will explain everything at your convenience. Augusta. She sealed all 4 letters, called the family owl, an elderly and disapproving bird named Reginald, and sent them out in the late afternoon light, one after another, watching them climb into the fading July sky. Then she went to the living room, picked up the photograph on the mantelpiece, Frank and Alice on their wedding day, laughing at something off camera, young and whole and real, and she said, quietly, to no one in the room, I'm sorry it took me this long. She put the photograph back. She straightened it. She went to make dinner. Neville came downstairs at 6 to find the table properly set, roast chicken in the middle, his grandmother in her good chair at the head of it, and he sat down and served himself and said, after a minute, Healer Strout, she was checking for something specific, wasn't she? Not just a general check. Augusta served herself a slice of chicken. What makes you say that? The way she watched the sphere. Like she was looking for something she expected to find, not looking to see what was there. Augusta looked at him across the table. 11 years old. Round face, his mother's eyes, a toad asleep in a tank by the stairs. Yes, she said. She was looking for something specific. Did she find it? A pause. A choice. We'll know more in a few days, Augusta said. And when we know, I will tell you everything. I promise you that. He looked at her for a moment, this boy who had grown up learning that grown-ups kept things from you not because they were cruel but because they thought it was kind, and who had therefore learned to read the weight of things that weren't being said. He looked at her and read the weight, and then he nodded, slowly, and said, "Okay. Thanks for telling me that much." They ate dinner. He told her about something he'd read in his copy of 1000 Magical Herbs and Fungi, something about the growth patterns of Devil's Snare that he'd found genuinely interesting, in the way he found most things that grew genuinely interesting. She listened and asked questions and watched him talk, and for a little while the evening was just an evening. After dinner, after the plates were cleared and Neville had gone back upstairs, Augusta stood at the sink with her hands in the soapy water and let herself think, plainly and precisely, about what she was starting. The man she was going after was Albus Dumbledore. He was the chief warlock of the Wizengamot, the supreme mugwump of the International Confederation of Wizards, the former Transfiguration professor and headmaster of Hogwarts. He was, in the minds of most of magical Britain, something between a headmaster and a god. He had been the central figure in the defeat of Grindelwald. He was widely credited with the defeat of Voldemort, or at least with having put in place the conditions that led to it. His portrait was going to be in every ministry corridor eventually regardless of whether it was deserved. And he had put his hands on her grandson's magic when Neville was 2 years old and made him small. The water was warm. The kitchen smelled of roast chicken and thyme. Augusta Longbottom finished the washing up. She dried her hands on the tea towel. She hung it neatly on its hook. She walked to the stairs and listened to the creak of Neville's floorboards overhead, the small domestic noise of a boy getting ready for bed. Then she went to her study, unlocked the bottom drawer, and took out the notebook she had been keeping, quietly, for 6 years, of every small thing that hadn't sat right. Every moment where the ministry's explanation hadn't quite matched the shape of what happened. Every occasion where she'd felt, just briefly, the distinct sensation of a larger hand arranging things. She opened it to a new page. She wrote Thursday, July 29, 1991 at the top. She underlined it. And she began to write. Chapter 2, The Record. The mandatory report hit Amelia Bones's desk at 4:47 on a Thursday afternoon, which meant it arrived 17 minutes before she would have left for a meeting she'd been quietly dreading. A budget review with Cornelius Fudge that would inevitably involve Fudge saying the word streamlining 6 times without meaning anything by it. The report's arrival saved her from that particular meeting in more ways than one, because once she read the first page she sat back down, closed her office door, and didn't leave until 8:30. The Department of Magical Law Enforcement occupied the second floor of the Ministry of Magic, which meant it got better natural light than the Auror office but worse plumbing than the Department of Magical Accidents. Amelia's corner office had a view of the atrium's enchanted ceiling, artificial sky, perpetually optimistic weather, and 2 walls of filing cabinets that had been charmed to look like bookshelves because she'd found the filing cabinets made Junior Aurors visibly anxious. On her desk she kept 3 photographs, a perpetually cold cup of tea, and a glass paperweight that her niece Susan had given her 2 birthdays ago. It was shaped like a badger. She found it grounding. She read the report twice. Then she read the technical appendix that Strout had included, which was dense with healing terminology and diagnostic notation that Amelia could follow at perhaps 60% comprehension, enough to understand what it was saying. Enough to understand that this was not a routine mandatory filing. She pressed the intercom on her desk. "Fletcher, is Scrimgeour still in?" "Left 10 minutes ago, ma'am." "Good." Rufus Scrimgeour was her head of Auror office and an excellent Auror and someone whose instinct, in situations like this, would be to treat it as an investigative matter before it was an institutional one. Which was the right instinct for most things, but not for this. She needed to think before she let Auror start moving. "Get me the Longbottom family file," she said. And anything cross-referenced to Frank and Alice Longbottom from 1980 onwards. And, she paused, pull the historical records on core-binding cases. Anything involving deliberate magical suppression. Go back to 1970. A silence from the intercom that indicated Fletcher was recalibrating. Ma'am, that's a significant pull. I'm aware. Tomorrow morning is fine for the historical records. The Longbottom file tonight. Yes, ma'am. She released the intercom and looked again at the report. At the section Strout had titled, in the precise careful language of clinical documentation, Evidence of Deliberate Magical Core Suppression, Multi-Layered Binding Detected, Mandatory Referral. And below that, in the technical notes, the charm architecture of the identified bindings most closely corresponds to methodology associated with advanced magical practitioners of significant power. Stylistic markers are consistent and identifiable. Full forensic notation provided in Appendix C. Appendix C said, in 17 pages of precise healer's notation, what Augusta's letter had said in one sentence: "This looks like Albus Dumbledore." Amelia set the report down. She picked up the Badger paperweight and turned it over in her hands. She looked at the enchanted ceiling through her window, where the permanent afternoon of the atrium was slowly turning to a permanent early evening. She had spent 23 years in the DMLE. She had investigated Death Eaters and corrupt ministry officials and financial frauds and one extremely memorable case involving a rogue bludger and a conspiracy that had reached the Department of Magical Games and Sports at its very highest levels. She had seen people she respected do things she hadn't expected and people she doubted do things that surprised her. But this. She set the paperweight down and reached for her quill. The next morning she arrived at the ministry at 6:30, 2 hours before anyone else on her floor, and spread the Longbottom file across her desk. It was, as she'd expected, thick. Frank Longbottom had been a senior orer, Alice had been one of the finest duelers the program had produced, and their case had been one of the defining tragedies of the war. The torture at the hands of Bellatrix Lestrange, Rodolphius and Rabaston Lestrange, and Bartemius Crouch Jr. The permanent damage. St. Mungo's, long-term ward. The boy, Neville, left with Augusta. She had known all of this. She had attended the Lestrange trial. She had read the case files. What she had not read before, because it had been filed in a subsection of the cross-referenced medical records that was not standard orer case material, was a notation from the St. Mungo's admitting healer from November 1981. Written in the immediate aftermath of Frank and Alice's admission. It said, both patients exhibiting total magical core collapse consistent with sustained cruciatus exposure. During initial assessment of child Neville Longbottom, age 15 months, core assessment performed to check for secondary magical trauma. Core appeared unusually quiescent for child of this age. As child has otherwise not been exposed to the same curse, queried possible shock response suppression, noted for monitoring but no immediate intervention recommended. Signed, Healer T. Whitmore. Amelia read that 3 times. Unusually quiescent. 15 months old. A month after Voldemort's fall. A time when, in the chaos and grief and reshaping of magical Britain, a very specific child, the child of 2 celebrated orers, the child who had been, along with another infant, a possible target of a prophecy that everyone was still working out the meaning of, would have been, if certain people were being thorough, an object of significant strategic interest. She pulled out a piece of parchment and began making a timeline. It was not the timeline of a woman who was building a case. Not yet. It was the timeline of a woman who was trying to understand the shape of something before she decided what to do about it. By 9 o'clock when Fletcher arrived, knocked, and found her surrounded by files and 3 cups of tea in varying states of abandonment, she had a timeline that ran from October 1981 to the present day and had 5 significant gaps that she did not like and 1 significant connection that she liked even less. Fletcher, she said, without looking up. Sit down. He sat. He was 28, efficient, ambitious in the careful way of people who were smart enough to know that ambition too openly displayed was its own liability. "What I'm about to tell you goes nowhere outside this office," she said. "Not to Scrimgeour, not to the minister, not to your friends over lunch. Not until I say." He looked at the spread of files on her desk. "Yes, ma'am. I need you to contact Miriam Strout at St. Mungo's and arrange for her to come in for a formal meeting. Not an interrogation, a consultation. She's a witness, not a subject. Make that clear." She paused. "I also need you to pull every mandatory reporting case St. Mungo's has filed involving deliberate magical interference with a minor in the last decade. All of them. Not just the ones that reached prosecution. All of them, including the ones that were reviewed and filed inactive." Fletcher was writing. "Anything else?" "Yes." She looked up. "I need to know who else Healer Strout has filed mandatory reports on in the last 15 years. Her complete filing history. I need to understand her professional record before this goes further, not because I doubt her findings, but because I need to know what we're working with. I'll need to go through St. Mungo's Records Department." "I know. Be polite and cite Section 34 of the Magical Medical Records Act. They'll cooperate." She picked up her quill again. "And get me coffee. Real coffee. Not the stuff from the third floor." He stood. "Yes, ma'am. One more thing, you have the budget review rescheduled with the minister for 11 o'clock. "Cancel it," she said. "Tell him something urgent has come up. He'll want to know what. Tell him I'm reviewing a mandatory referral case. He'll accept that. He never asks about mandatory referrals because they bore him." She looked at the timeline on her desk. "Good." Strout arrived at 11:15, which was the time Amelia had asked for, in her full healer's robes, and sat across the desk from Amelia Bones with the air of someone who had expected this and had come prepared. Amelia liked her immediately. She had a gift for reading people in the first 30 seconds, and Strout read as honest, precise, not easily frightened, and specifically not frightened of Amelia, which was either confidence or knowledge of her own professional position, and either way it was useful. "Your report," Amelia said. "Walk me through it. Not the paperwork, your experience of the examination. What you saw. You want it in plain language, not clinical notation. Please." Strout put her hands flat on the desk. "Neville Longbottom has a magical core that has been deliberately, carefully, and repeatedly suppressed. He is demonstrating roughly a third to 40% of his actual magical capacity. The binding is sophisticated, not something you'd see from a journeyman practitioner. This took skill, power, and specific knowledge of core binding charm architecture that is not common." "How specific is not common?" "There are perhaps a dozen people alive in Britain who could do this," Strout said. "Possibly fewer. The technique requires a level of raw power that simply isn't widely distributed, plus a detailed knowledge of magical core anatomy that most practitioners, even most senior healers, don't have. And you've attributed the stylistic markers to Albus Dumbledore's documented methodology, yes. I want to be precise about what that means." Strout held her gaze steadily. "I cannot tell you that Albus Dumbledore walked into a room and cast these spells. What I can tell you is that the charm architecture, the specific way the binding layers interact, the particular style of the locking mechanism at each layer's base, is identifiably consistent with published and documented applications of Dumbledore's work in theoretical core magic. He published a paper in 1963 in the Journal of Advanced Magical Theory on core binding for containment of dangerous individuals. The architecture in that paper and the architecture in Neville Longbottom's core are," she paused, choosing her word, "cognate." Amelia wrote cognate and underlined it. "Is the paper publicly available?" "At the time of publication, yes. It's archived in the British Wizarding Academic Registry. I'll want a copy." Amelia set her quill down. "How long has the binding been in place?" The earliest layer, the foundational one, dates to between 2 and 4 years after Neville's birth. So between 1982 and 1984, based on the degradation patterns in the charm matrix. Strout paused. He was born in 1980. The earliest possible date of the foundational layer is when he was about 2. And the most recent? The outermost layer, a refreshing of the binding, is less than 2 years old. Which means the application was made no earlier than the summer of 1989. Who had regular access to Neville Longbottom in the summer of 1989? Amelia said, mostly to herself, looking at her timeline. Augusta Longbottom mentioned she'd been away that July, Strout said. Visiting relatives. Neville stayed with a family friend. Amelia looked up sharply. She mentioned it because of a specific magical incident Neville described during examination, an occasion when his suppression appeared to briefly fail and he demonstrated unusually strong accidental magic. He was 7. Augusta was away. Strout's voice was very level. The binding was refreshed, I would estimate, within months of that incident. The outermost layer shows the markers of a reactive application, something applied in response to a breach. The badger paperweight sat on the edge of the desk. Amelia didn't reach for it, but she was aware of it. Was Augusta Longbottom the family friend Neville stayed with? She asked. No. According to Augusta, he stayed with a colleague of Frank Longbottom's. A retired Auror named, Strout checked a note she'd brought, Elphia's Doge. The name was familiar. Amelia knew it the way anyone who paid attention to magical Britain's social geography knew it, Elphia's Doge, old family, known associate of Albus Dumbledore. Close friends since their school days. A man who, if asked to do Dumbledore a favor, would very possibly not ask what it was first. She wrote the name down. I don't want to speculate beyond the evidence, Strout said. No, Amelia agreed. Neither do I. She folded her hands on the desk. Healer Strout, your report will trigger an automatic investigation under Section 12 of the Magical Children Protection Act. You know that. I know. That investigation, once opened, cannot be quietly closed. It can be deprioritized, buried in administrative backlog, starved of resources, reassigned to someone who won't push. I want you to understand that that is possible and that the pressure to let that happen will come from significant places. Strout looked at her steadily. I know. And? I filed the report, Strout said simply. I knew what I was filing when I filed it. I examined a child whose magic had been deliberately stunted since before he could walk. Something moved behind her professional composure, not distress exactly, but a clean, hard anger, like a current under still water. My professional opinion is my professional opinion. It doesn't change because the subject of the attribution is Albus Dumbledore. Amelia looked at her for a long moment. Good, she said. Because I'm going to need you to be prepared to testify to it. Fletcher brought the historical records that afternoon, the pull from the DMLE archives on deliberate magical core interference cases going back to 1970. It was a smaller file than Amelia had hoped, which told its own story. Either such cases were genuinely rare, or they had been routinely filed inactive and never properly investigated, which also had its own implications. She went through each case with a fine-tipped quill and a growing sense of something cold settling in her chest. There were 6 cases in 20 years involving deliberate magical suppression of a minor's core. 3 had been investigated and found to have non-criminal explanations, parental applications of containment charms, which was illegal but prosecuted as civil rather than criminal matters. 1 had been referred to the Wiesengemot and resulted in a suspended sentence. 2 had been filed inactive. Both of those filings bore, in the corner of the initial review form where the name of the reviewing officer was entered, the same initials. HMP. She didn't recognize them. She sent Fletcher to the personnel archives. He came back 20 minutes later. Henry Malcolm Perkins. Orer, 1975 to 1989. Left the service, took early retirement. Currently, Fletcher checked, he's on the advisory board of the Hogwarts Board of Governors. Amelia sat very still. Fletcher, she said. Do you know what this reminds me of? No, ma'am. It reminds me of nothing, because I have never seen anything like this in 23 years. She picked up the file with the 2 inactive cases. Get me everything on Henry Malcolm Perkins. And I want to know which cases he was assigned to during his last 5 years in the service, specifically anything touching Hogwarts, the Board of Governors, or Albus Dumbledore. Yes, ma'am. And don't mention Dumbledore's name outside this office, she said. Not yet. Not until I know what we have. Fletcher left. Amelia opened the first of the 2 inactive files. The child in question was a 7-year-old girl from Leeds, brought in by her mother in 1983, magical core scan performed by a junior healer at St. Mungo's. Findings: suppression charm present, deliberate in origin, source unknown. Mandatory referral filed. The DMLE had received it, Perkins had been assigned as reviewing officer, and the file notation read, in his spidery handwriting, evidence insufficient for formal investigation. Natural core variants cannot be excluded. File inactive per standard procedure. No interview records. No follow-up examination. No inquiry into who might have had access to the child. The mother's name was in the file. Amelia noted it. The second inactive case, a 9-year-old boy, 1986, Birmingham. Same pattern. Same reviewing officer. Same notation. Natural core variants cannot be excluded. Amelia looked at the 2 files side by side. Then she looked at the Strout report on Neville. Then she looked at her timeline. She reached into her desk drawer and took out a fresh piece of parchment. This one she didn't head with a case number or a filing reference. She wrote at the top, in her own shorthand that only she could read, people who need to be found. She began a list. At 3:30, Augusta Longbottom's reply to her letter arrived. It was, as Amelia had expected given the sender, extremely direct. Amelia, thank you for your note. I am available at your convenience. I have documentation going back 6 years. I also have names of people you should speak to in a specific order, and I am prepared to share both. I will come to the ministry or you may come to me, your choice. Whatever is more useful to the investigation. Augusta. Amelia read it once. The phrase documentation going back 6 years hit her specifically, the measured patience of a woman who had been collecting evidence quietly, for years, waiting for the moment when she had enough. That was either extremely impressive or slightly terrifying. Probably both. She wrote back immediately, come to me. Tomorrow morning. 8 o'clock, my office. Use the visitor's entrance and give your name to the desk. I'll have you cleared. Bring everything. Amelia Bones. Augusta arrived at 7:55 with a dragonhide briefcase, a hat that had a stuffed vulture on it and was absolutely not a statement of any kind, and the expression of a woman who had been waiting for this meeting for years and intended to make every minute count. Amelia had cleared the conference table adjacent to her office. She had sent Fletcher for the real coffee again. She had the Strout report, the historical files, her timeline, and the Perkins material laid out in the order she wanted to go through them. Augusta sat, placed the briefcase on the table, looked at the spread of material, and said, "You've been busy." "So have you," Amelia said, looking at the briefcase. 6 years of being busy, Augusta said. "In the beginning I thought I was paranoid. Then I thought I was grieving, which makes people see patterns. Then, she opened the briefcase, I thought I was probably right." She began laying things on the table. The first was a letter, dated 1985, from a ministry official who had attempted to query the terms of the custody arrangement for Neville, a routine check that had apparently been flagged, reviewed, and then quietly dropped. The name of the official who'd dropped it was not Perkins, but the name of the office that had instructed him to drop it was the office of the Chief Warlock. Amelia stared at that for a moment. The second was a note from Neville's primary school teacher, written in response to a letter Augusta had sent querying Neville's development. The teacher had said, in the careful language of a Muggle educator who had no framework for what she was describing, "Neville is a lovely boy, but I have noticed that he seems to find things harder than you might expect given how bright he clearly is. It's as if there's I don't know how to put this, a glass wall between him and what he's trying to do." A glass wall. Augusta had underlined it. The third item was a list of dates, specific occasions when Neville had demonstrated unusually strong accidental magic, cross-referenced against Augusta's own absence from home. The correlation was not perfect, but it was visible. The strongest magical incidents clustered around the times when Augusta had been away. The fourth was a copy of a visitor record from Longbottom family property, a membership record from a wizarding nature reserve that Augusta had used to access in Frank's name. Someone had queried the record in 1986. The query had come from the Hogwarts administrative office. No reason given. What was at the nature reserve? Amelia asked. Nothing significant, Augusta said. That's the point. There was no reason to query it. It was a flag, someone checking whether I was using Frank's credentials. She paused. I was never asked about it. I only found out through a friend in the records office who noticed it and thought it was odd. Amelia looked at the table. At 6 years of careful accumulation, the kind of evidence that no single piece of which would stand alone in a court, but which together had a shape. The shape was not comfortable. Augusta, she said carefully. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me even if the honest answer is difficult. Ask. Is it possible, not likely, but possible, that any of this is coincidental? That Neville's suppression has a different origin than the one Strout's diagnostic suggests, and that the other elements, the dropped custody inquiry, the visitor record query, the inactive DMLE files, are separate and unrelated institutional failings? Augusta was quiet for a moment. It was the quiet of a woman considering the question genuinely rather than dismissing it. It's possible, she said. Individually, each thing could be coincidence. Or institutional negligence, which is endemic enough to explain almost anything. She looked at Amelia directly. But Miriam Strout looked at my grandson's magical core and told me it bears the stylistic signature of Albus Dumbledore's published work. That specific finding is not subject to coincidence. That is a professional medical assessment. No, Amelia agreed. It isn't. They sat with that for a moment. What do you need from me? Augusta asked. Practically. What makes your case stronger? More children, Amelia said, and hated saying it. If Neville is not the only one, if there is a pattern of deliberate suppression involving different children with a common point of contact, that is not coincidental. That is a practice. She paused. Strout's diagnostic methodology can be applied retrospectively in many cases. If we can identify other children, other families, who have shown the same pattern, I may be able to help with that, Augusta said. Amelia looked at her. The Longbottom family has connections, Augusta said, with the particular simplicity of someone stating an obvious fact without vanity. My late husband was well regarded. Frank and Alice had friends across the Auror community and beyond. When I began to have concerns, 6 years ago, I quietly asked questions. She reached into the briefcase again. I am not the only grandmother with a notebook, Amelia. She placed 3 more files on the table. Each one was from a different family, and each contained a similar constellation of observations. A child who seemed less magically capable than expectation or lineage would suggest, specific incidents of unusual strength, a period of proximity to certain individuals, a return to apparent weakness. None of them had ever been to Strout. None of them had been formally assessed. These families would agree to a diagnostic? Amelia asked. I believe so. If it were framed correctly, if they understood what it was for. Augusta paused. They trust me. They will be more resistant to an official approach initially. But if I make the introduction, Strout handles the assessment, and you receive the results through the proper channels, it works, Amelia said. That works. She looked at the files, then at Augusta. You understand that if this goes where I think it's going, Dumbledore will know about the investigation before we're ready. His position at the Wisengamot, at Hogwarts, at the International Confederation, he has information access we can't fully account for. The moment we start contacting more families, more healers, pulling more records, he'll know, Augusta said. Yes. I know. Augusta folded her hands on the table. I want him to know. I want him to understand, clearly, that there is no managing this away. No quiet resolution. No, her voice was precise and utterly cold, greater good calculation that makes this acceptable. She paused. But I don't want him to know before you're ready. When you decide it's time, I want to be there. Amelia looked at her for a long moment. Augusta Longbottom was 67 years old, impeccably dressed, with a vulture on her hat and 6 years of collected evidence in a dragon-hide briefcase and a kind of banked fury so deep and controlled it had apparently been burning without visible flame for most of a decade. When the time comes, Amelia said, you'll be there. That afternoon Amelia sent Strout a coded message through the secure medical liaison channel, need additional assessments. 3 families. Priority. Full methodology, same as Longbottom. Report directly to my office. The reply came within the hour, I'll need 3 days per assessment. Can begin Monday. Send names. She sent the names from Augusta's files. Then she sat back and looked at the enchanted ceiling through her window, the permanent gentle light of the atrium's artificial afternoon, and she thought about what it meant to investigate Albus Dumbledore. About what the political landscape of magical Britain looked like if the centerpiece were removed. About which of her colleagues in the ministry would stand with her and which would find pressing reasons to stand elsewhere. She thought about the 2 inactive files with Perkins's initials in the corner. About the children in those files, who were now teenagers or adults, who had probably spent their lives believing themselves weak or ordinary or simply less. She reached for the Badger paperweight and held it. Then she opened the bottom drawer of her desk and retrieved the file she kept on ministry personnel, specifically, the personnel of the Wisengamot's Administrative Support Office, where the Chief Warlock's day-to-day operations were managed. She needed to know who reported to whom, and what the information pathway looked like between her investigation and Dumbledore's desk. She found 3 names she trusted completely. She also found one name that worried her, a senior administrative clerk who had worked in the Chief Warlock's office for 11 years and had then transferred to the DMLE Records Department 3 years ago. The transfer had been routine and the performance record clean. But 11 years was enough time to form loyalties. She made a note. She would route nothing at all, through that clerk section. At 6 o'clock, Fletcher appeared in her doorway with a fresh coffee and the look of someone who wanted very much to ask what was happening and knew better than to. Go home, Fletcher, she said. Yes, ma'am. He paused. How long is this going to take? She looked at her timeline. At the shape of the thing she'd been building all day, the architecture of it, the years it had taken to grow. As long as it takes, she said. But we're going to Hogwarts before term starts. Fletcher blinked. Hogwarts. I want this confrontation on record and in person, not in letters. She picked up her quill. And I want to see his face when he realizes the report has already been filed and the investigation is already open and there is absolutely nothing he can do about it. Fletcher left quietly. Amelia made 3 more notes on her timeline, set her quill down, and drank the coffee while it was still hot. Outside, the ministry's enchanted ceiling had shifted to evening, a warm, golden light that had nothing to do with the real sky above London, cheerful and completely artificial. She looked at it and thought that this was probably Dumbledore's greatest skill, making the artificial light seem warm enough that people stopped wondering about the real sky. She gathered her files. She shut off her office lamp. She went home, and slept better than she had any right to. Chapter 3. The visit Hogwarts in August was a different creature entirely from Hogwarts in term. Without students it breathed differently, slower, quieter, the way old buildings do when they're left to themselves. The enchanted ceiling of the great hall showed a pure, uncomplicated blue. The corridors smelled of stone and beeswax and something older underneath, something the castle had been accumulating since before anyone currently alive had been born. The staircases moved on their usual eccentric schedules, but without anyone to inconvenience. They seemed almost contemplative about it, swinging from landing to landing with a kind of idle deliberateness. Amelia Bones had been inside Hogwarts 3 times as an adult. Each time it had done something to her equilibrium that she found professionally inconvenient: the sheer weight of the place, the accumulated history pressing down through the stones, the specific way it made you feel both very important and absolutely insignificant. She was aware of it now as she walked through the entrance hall and refused to let it show. Behind her, Augusta Longbottom walked as if she owned the floor. She had worn her good robes, severe, dark green, immaculately pressed, and the vulture hat, which Amelia had come to understand was not eccentricity but deliberate psychological warfare. Beside Augusta was Miriam Strout in full lime green healer's robes, carrying a case that contained her diagnostic equipment and 3 completed additional assessment reports that had arrived on Amelia's desk 2 days ago and confirmed everything. 3 more children. 3 more suppressed cores. 3 families who had now given signed consent for their findings to be entered into formal DMLE evidence. There was also, walking slightly to Amelia's left with the air of someone who had been summoned and come anyway, Croker the solicitor, short, beetle-browed, 60 years old and carrying a leather satchel that bulged with legal documentation in the aggressive way of a man who had come prepared for a fight and expected to enjoy it. 5 people, walking through Hogwarts in August, unannounced. They had not sent word ahead. That had been Amelia's specific choice, made after a long discussion with Augusta on the evening before. Dumbledore would know they were coming the moment they crossed the school wards. She had no illusions about that. But knowing they were coming and knowing what they were carrying were different things, and she wanted as little time as possible between the former and the latter. The castle's caretaker, a young man named Argus Filch, raw-nerved and suspicious, with a cat named Mrs. Norris who appeared from nowhere and then stared at all of them, tried to tell them the headmaster wasn't receiving visitors outside of term. "Tell him head of the DMLE, Amelia Bones," Amelia said pleasantly, "and tell him it's not a social call." Filch went. Mrs. Norris continued to stare. "Remarkable cat," Augusta said, in the tone of someone who did not find the cat remarkable in any positive sense. They waited in the entrance hall. Strout checked a reading on one of her instruments, force of habit. Croker opened his satchel and reordered something inside it. Augusta stood with her hands folded and her eyes on the great staircase and her face doing absolutely nothing. Filch reappeared in 4 minutes. Dumbledore would see them in his office. The gargoyle at the base of the headmaster's tower staircase was already moving when they arrived, which meant Dumbledore had opened it from above. Amelia noted that. He was managing the encounter from the beginning, making small choices, the open door, the waiting welcome, that established a frame of hospitality, of a man who had nothing to hide and everything to offer. She was not interested in his frame. The circular office at the top of the stairs was exactly as she remembered from her one previous visit, 20 years ago, as a student, for reasons she'd long since forgotten. The portraits of previous headmasters lined the walls, some awake, some dozing, all of them with the quality of painted observers who were listening even when they appeared not to be. The desk was enormous and old. The various instruments on the side tables hummed and glittered in the summer light coming through the windows. Fawkes the Phoenix sat on his perch and watched them with orange eyes that contained, as they always did, the specifically unsettling impression of intelligence and judgment. Albus Dumbledore stood behind his desk. He was 80 years old and looked perhaps 60, or at least looked like what 60 wanted to be when it had spent decades in the practice of magic. White hair and beard, half-moon spectacles, robes of deep blue. He had, as he always had, the quality of warmth, a kind of radiant benevolence that came off him like heat from a fire. It was genuine, Amelia believed. That was the complicated part. It was completely genuine, and it was also completely inadequate as a response to what was in the files under her arm. He looked at all 5 of them, and something crossed his face, just briefly, just for a moment, and then it was gone, replaced by the warmth, the welcome, the slight lift of concern. "Amelia," he said. "Augusta. And Miriam, it's been some years." His eyes moved to Croaker. "I don't believe I know you." "Phineas Croaker," Croaker said. "Solicitor. I represent the Longbottom family and, as of yesterday, 3 additional families whose names I'll be providing to the DMLE shortly." Dumbledore's expression adjusted. Not significantly, just enough to communicate that he was taking this seriously, which was the right response, which was why Amelia didn't trust it. "Please," he said, gesturing to the chairs arranged in a half-circle before his desk. "Sit down." "We'll stand," Augusta said. It was the first thing she'd said since the entrance hall. A small pause. "Of course," Dumbledore said. He came around the desk and stood before it rather than behind it, removing the physical barrier, equalizing the geography, another small considered choice. "Tell me what this is about." Amelia set the files on the edge of his desk. On the 29th of July, healer Miriam Strout performed a full magical core assessment on Neville Longbottom at the request of his grandmother. The assessment identified deliberate, multi-layered magical suppression of Neville's core, dating to approximately 1982 or 1983. Under Section 12 of the Magical Children Protection Act, healer Strout filed a mandatory report with the DMLE. I received that report and opened a formal investigation. She paused. In the course of that investigation, 3 additional children were assessed by healer Strout. All 3 presented with the same pattern of suppression. All 4 cases bear stylistic forensic markers consistent with a specific and identifiable magical methodology. She stopped. Dumbledore looked at the files on his desk. He did not reach for them. "You're describing," he said, quietly, "a very serious allegation." "I'm describing a formal DMLE investigation," Amelia said. "The allegation is contained in healer Strout's diagnostic reports. I'm here for a conversation." Dumbledore looked at Strout. "Miriam. You believe your findings are, my findings are what they are," Strout said. "I don't believe them. I documented them. The methodology of the binding on Neville Longbottom's core is consistent with your published work in core binding theory, Headmaster. The 1963 paper in the Journal of Advanced Magical Theory." Her voice was clinical and completely without hostility, which was somehow more devastating than anger. "The architecture is identifiable. Magical technique, as I noted in my report, is like handwriting." The office was very quiet. One of the portraits, an old witch in the corner, had stopped pretending to sleep. Dumbledore was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the windows, at the bright August sky outside, and then he turned back to them and his expression was something that Amelia had not expected. It was not denial. It was not the strategic performance of wounded innocence. It was not deflection or legal hedging or any of the dozen responses she had prepared herself for. It was sorrow. Genuine, complicated, deeply inhabited sorrow. "Sit down," he said again. "Please." "Albus," Augusta's voice was very low. "Augusta." He looked at her, and what was in his face then was something that sat between an apology and an argument, and that was almost worse than either. "Please. Let me explain." Augusta sat. It was not compliance, it was the deliberate, weaponized patience of a woman who wanted to hear every word. The others sat. Amelia kept the files in her hand. Dumbledore moved to the window. He stood with his back to them for a moment, looking out at the grounds, the lawn, the lake, the beginning of the forest. In November of 1981, he said, when Tom Riddle fell, I had a problem. A significant, urgent, and extraordinarily delicate problem. He turned back. The prophecy, some of you will know of it, some will not. It spoke of a child born at the end of July with the power to defeat the Dark Lord, born to parents who had thrice defied him. He looked at Augusta. There were 2 children who fitted the criteria. Harry Potter and Neville Longbottom. Augusta's face was marble. Tom was defeated before he chose, Dumbledore continued. His attack on Harry Potter, his attempt to kill a child, triggered the protection of Lily Potter's sacrifice. The magic that resulted it was something that had never been done before. A love-based sacrificial protection, embedded in Harry's very skin. He paused. But I did not know, in those first weeks, whether Tom was truly gone. Whether he would return. And I did not know what the prophecy's resolution meant for Neville. Whether he remained, in some sense, a target. Whether the Dark Lord's followers, who were not all imprisoned, not yet, might choose to act against the second child the prophecy might have indicated. The Lestranges acted against him, Strout said. Through his parents. Yes. Something crossed Dumbledore's face. After the fact. And I had failed to prevent it. Which I will carry as long as I live. He moved away from the window and back to the desk, not sitting but standing beside it, and he looked at Augusta with an expression that was completely unguarded. I believed, Augusta, that reducing Neville's observable magical signature would make him a less attractive target. That if he appeared ordinary, unremarkable, the remnants of Tom's organization would have no reason to seek him out. That he would simply be overlooked. The silence that followed this was enormous. You thought, Augusta said, with a quiet so total it was almost gravitational, that making my grandson appear weak would protect him. Yes. And you made this decision without telling me. I did. Without telling any member of his family. Yes. Without any legal authority, any medical consultation, any consideration of what it would do to him to grow up believing himself incapable. Augusta, I am not finished. Her voice had not risen. It did not need to. You put a binding on a 2-year-old boy's magic and then you refreshed it, you came back and you did it again, because you decided, in your private and unilateral judgment, that this was necessary. And you did not tell him. You did not tell me. You allowed him to grow up thinking he had failed to inherit his parents' gift. That he was, her voice finally shifted, very slightly, into something that was not rage exactly but was the controlled form of what rage becomes when it has nowhere adequate to go, less. Dumbledore held her gaze. He did not look away. Yes, he said. And the other children? Amelia said. Because she needed to hear it, and because Augusta needed a moment that she wasn't going to ask for. Dumbledore turned to her. He looked tired in a way that was different from old. There were others whose situations I assessed as similar. Children with significant magical potential, connected to families with histories of involvement on both sides of the war. Children who might be targets. He paused. I made the same assessment in each case. How many? Amelia asked. A pause. 7, Dumbledore said. Over the course of approximately 8 years. The number landed in the room like something dropped from a height. 7 children, Strout said, and her clinical composure cracked, just slightly, just at the edges. 7 children whose magical cores I believed I was protecting them, Dumbledore said, and his voice had something in it that was not defensive but was absolutely certain. I want you to understand that. I did not do this with malice. I did not do this carelessly. I did it because I had looked at the landscape of the world after the war and calculated that these children faced real danger, and that reducing their visibility was the most effective protection I could give them. More effective than telling their families? Amelia said. More effective than working with the DMLE, the people whose actual job it is to protect. The DMLE in 1981 and 1982 was riddled with compromised individuals, Dumbledore said, and the certainty in his voice was absolute. I knew it. Bartemius Crouch knew it. Half the senior Aurors were either Death Eaters themselves, Death Eater sympathizers, or so traumatized by the war that their judgment could not be relied upon. Going to the ministry was not an option I trusted. So you decided to trust yourself instead, Amelia said. Above everyone else. Indefinitely. I decided to do what I believed was necessary. You decided, Amelia said, that you knew better. Not just about the war. Not just about strategy. But about what was best for specific children in specific families, without asking the people who actually loved them. She set the files down on his desk. All of them. The Strout reports, the historical inactive files, the additional assessment results, Perkins's records. That's not protection, Headmaster. That's control. Dumbledore looked at the files. He looked at them for a long moment, and his face was doing something that Amelia didn't fully have a name for, not quite guilt, not quite grief, not quite the expression of a man hearing something he hadn't considered before. More like the expression of a man hearing a thing that had always been true and had never quite reached him until now. Then Fawkes made a sound, not a song, just a low, musical note, and Dumbledore looked at the phoenix, and something in him seemed to settle. Not into resolution. Into something quieter than that. What happens now? He said. Now, Amelia said, I will tell you exactly what happens. I have 4 documented cases in front of me with forensic diagnostic support from a qualified healer. I have 2 additional inactive files from the DMLE's own archives that I am reopening. I will be seeking the identities of the remaining 3 children from your list of 7. I am asking you, here and now, as a formal request from the head of the DMLE, to provide those names. Dumbledore nodded, once. I'll give them to you. Good. Those families will be contacted and offered assessment. All findings will be gathered, and the complete file will be referred to the Wiesengemot for a formal hearing. In the meantime, she paused, I am recommending to the Board of Governors, through proper channels, that your position as headmaster of Hogwarts be suspended pending the outcome of the investigation. Something crossed his face at that. And the Chief Warlock's role, Amelia continued, is a Wiesengemot matter. I'll be speaking to Griselda Marchbanks and Tiberius Ogden today. I suspect they'll have their own view on whether you can continue in that capacity while under formal investigation. The portraits on the walls were all awake now. All of them. Watching with the accumulated attention of centuries of former headmasters, and none of them speaking, and the weight of that attentiveness was considerable. Dumbledore stood very straight. He was not diminished, that was the strange thing. He was still entirely himself, still the same magnitude of presence. But something had shifted in the room. Some imbalance had corrected. The children, he said. The bindings can be removed. I know, Strout said. I'll be handling that. Each child and their family will be given the choice of removal and the timing will be theirs. Her voice was deliberate. Not yours. Theirs. He absorbed that. Nodded. Augusta had not spoken since she'd told him she wasn't finished. She had sat through the whole exchange with her hands folded and her face still, and she had not looked away from Dumbledore once. Now she stood. I want to say one thing, she said. And I want you to hear it, Albus. Not process it. Not factor it into your calculations. Hear it. He looked at her. Frank and Alice believed in you, she said. They gave everything, because they trusted that the war was worth fighting and that you were a man worth following. My son died in everything but body because he believed in a world worth protecting. Her voice was steady, and it was the steadiness of someone who has spent years deciding not to break. And their boy, their brilliant, good, brave boy, grew up believing he was ordinary. Believing he'd somehow failed to inherit what they were. That in all the ways that mattered to him most, he wasn't enough. She held Dumbledore's gaze. You took that from him. Not Bellatrix. Not the Lestranges. Not Voldemort. You. Because you decided, in your private judgment, that it was necessary. She paused. I don't forgive you. I don't expect to. And I am not telling you this because I want you to feel it. I am telling you this because you should know what it cost. She picked up her bag. I'll be outside, she said to Amelia, and walked out. The door closed behind her. The meeting continued for another 40 minutes. Dumbledore gave the 3 remaining names, quietly, cooperatively, with the air of a man who had crossed some internal threshold and was now, for the first time in this business, simply doing what was required. Croker took notes and asked 3 extremely precise legal questions that established on the record that Dumbledore was providing the information voluntarily and under formal DMLE request. Strout asked about the specific binding methodology used on each child so that she could tailor the removal process appropriately. Amelia watched Dumbledore throughout. She had expected resistance. She had prepared for it. She had legal precedents and procedural mechanisms and Augusta's 6 years of notebooks and Strout's diagnostic reports and Croker's very large collection of documentation. She had been ready for a fight. What she got was a man who was exhausted in the specific way of someone who has been carrying something alone for a very long time and has finally, against his better judgment, put it down. Which was, she thought, its own kind of answer. A man who was innocent didn't look like that. A man who was merely calculating a new strategy didn't look like that either. This was the look of a man who had genuinely believed what he was doing was right, and who was sitting with, for the first time in full clarity, the damage the belief had done. It didn't excuse it. Nothing excused it. But it told her something important about the hearing to come, about how he would answer, what he would say, what the Wisengamot would see. At the end, when the 4 of them were at the office door, Dumbledore said, Amelia. She paused. The investigation, he said. There are people at the ministry who will try to stop it. Not because they know anything about what you're investigating, but because my removal from these positions creates instabilities that certain people would rather not manage. I want you to know, for whatever it's worth, that I will not be one of them. Amelia looked at him for a moment. I appreciate that, she said. But I want you to understand something clearly. I am not investigating you as a political act. I am not investigating you as a statement about your broader career or your role in the war or your contributions to this world. I am investigating 7 children whose magic was stolen from them by someone who thought he knew better than their families what they needed. She held his gaze. And I would do that regardless of whether you cooperated or not. She opened the door and walked down the stairs. Augusta was waiting in the corridor below the gargoyle, standing at the window that looked over the grounds, the late morning light on the lake. She looked completely composed. She had always looked completely composed. It was starting to feel to Amelia less like composure and more like armor so well made it had become part of the body. All right? Amelia asked. Fine, Augusta said, without turning from the window. Amelia stood beside her. The lake was very still in the August heat, the surface catching the light like a mirror that had decided to show you something other than yourself. He'll cooperate, Amelia said. He gave us the 3 names. He's not going to fight the suspension. Augusta nodded. He's going to be removed from the Chief Warlock's position, Amelia said. The investigation makes that effectively unavoidable. And the headmaster's role, he'll survive it, Augusta said, not bitterly. Factually. Men like Albus Dumbledore don't disappear. He'll teach, eventually, or advise, or write books. He'll have a quieter life but he'll have a life. She turned from the window. I am not trying to destroy him. I want to be clear about that. I know. I want accountability. I want the children, all 7, to know what happened and to have the choice to put it right. I want it on record, formally, that this was done and it was wrong. She looked at Amelia. And I want Neville to understand that he was never the problem. He'll understand, Amelia said. You'll make sure of it. Something changed in Augusta's face, briefly, barely visible. He's a good boy, she said. He is a genuinely good boy and he has no idea. She straightened, settled her hat, which had not moved. When does this go to the Wisengamot? I need 2 more weeks to complete the full file. The additional assessments, the Perkins inquiry, the archived cases. Amelia paused. And I need to decide how we control the public element. Augusta raised an eyebrow. You're planning to use Skeeter. It wasn't a question. Amelia almost smiled. I'm planning to ensure the story reaches the public through someone who will be thorough and who cannot be easily pressured. Rita Skeeter has her significant faults. But she is extremely difficult to intimidate, and the Daily Prophet circulation is such that once this is in print, it becomes impossible to quietly bury, Augusta said. Exactly. Amelia looked at her. I wanted to tell you beforehand. The story will name Neville. A pause. He'll be fine, Augusta said. He's stronger than he knows. He's about to find out just how much stronger. She moved toward the corridor, toward the direction of the stairs and the entrance hall and the apparition point beyond the gates. I need to get home. I promised him I'd explain everything this week. How do you think he'll take it? Augusta was quiet for a moment, walking. I think he'll be sad for about 10 minutes, she said. Then he'll be angry. And then, a pause, I think he'll want to know what he can actually do. And that, I suspect, will be the most interesting part. At the front gates of Hogwarts, the 4 of them gathered in the August heat. The castle rose behind them, enormous and indifferent, keeping its own counsel as it had always done. Filch watched from the gatehouse window with Mrs. Norris on his shoulder, both of them disapproving. Croaker snapped his satchel shut with the satisfaction of a man whose work there was done for the day, at least. I'll have the formal legal paperwork filed with the Board of Governors by end of week. The suspension recommendation will be in writing, with full procedural support. If they drag their feet, they won't, Amelia said. I'll make a personal call to every member of the board if necessary. Good. He tucked the satchel under his arm. The man cooperated today. That will complicate things at the hearing, in terms of public sympathy. Let it complicate things, Augusta said. The evidence is the evidence. Croaker looked at her. I like you, Augusta Longbottom, he said, with the straightforwardness of a man who rarely bothered to say things he didn't mean. I'll be in touch. He disapparated with a clean, economical crack. Strout had her bag in hand. I'll start the contact protocol for the 3 new families this week. I'll keep you both informed. She looked at Augusta. I'll have a removal plan ready for Neville within a fortnight. When you're ready, and when he is. Thank you, Miriam, Augusta said. For all of it. Strout looked at her, and something passed between them, 2 women who had each in their own way spent years looking at the shape of damage and trying to decide what to do about it. Alice would be glad, Strout said. If it means anything. It means something, Augusta said. Strout disapparated. Amelia and Augusta stood at the castle gates. The Hogwarts grounds spread away from them in the heat, the green, the shimmer of the lake, the mountains beyond. Amelia, Augusta said. Yes. Thank you for coming yourself. For not sending someone junior. I wouldn't have sent anyone junior, Amelia said simply. No, Augusta agreed. I didn't think you would. She gathered herself, the small, precise movement of a woman returning from wherever she had been, internally, and resuming her full external dimensions. I'll tell Neville tonight. And then I'll start making calls of my own. Marchbanks and Ogden will want to speak to me before the hearing. I intend to be prepared. I wouldn't expect anything less, Amelia said. Augusta Longbottom walked to the apparition point beyond the gate. She turned once, not to look at the castle but at Amelia, a straight, clear look that contained something that was not quite gratitude because it was larger than that, and then she was gone. Amelia stood alone at the Hogwarts gates for a moment, the castle behind her, the empty road ahead. The August sky was completely blue. She breathed the clean air, the specific clean of somewhere far enough from a city to remember what air was supposed to be. She thought about 7 children. About the years they'd spent operating at a third of their capacity, assuming the deficiency was theirs. About classrooms and homework and the specific shame of being less than what you should be, with no way to understand why. She thought about Dumbledore's face when Augusta spoke. The sorrow in it. The certainty underneath the sorrow, still intact even now, the certainty that he had been doing something necessary. A man who had shaped his entire moral universe around the concept of necessary things. She thought, the worst part of all of it is that he isn't wrong about the war. He isn't wrong about the danger. He might not be entirely wrong about those children having been targets. He is just completely, catastrophically wrong about what gave him the right. She disapparated. Chapter 4, The Fire. The story broke on a Wednesday. Rita Skeeter's article ran on the front page of the Daily Prophet under the headline, Children of the War, 7 Magical Minors Found with Deliberately Suppressed Cores, Former Chief Warlock Under Investigation. The subheading read, Healer's Diagnostic Reports Trigger DMLE Inquiry into Decade of Magical Interference. Amelia had given Skeeter 4 days with the story. 4 days of controlled, documented, entirely verifiable facts, the Strout reports, the DMLE investigation reference number, the Board of Governors suspension recommendation, the names of the families who had consented to be named. She had sat across from Skeeter in a cafe in Diagon Alley and watched the woman's acid green quill move with the speed of someone who had been waiting her entire career for something this significant, and had said, very clearly, every word of this is verifiable. Every claim is documented. You don't need to embellish this, Rita. The facts are enough. Skeeter had looked at her over her rhinestone-rimmed glasses and said, Darling, when have the facts ever not been enough when they're this good? The article was, by Skeeter's standards, almost restrained. It named Dumbledore in the 3rd paragraph, presented Strout's diagnostic findings with unusual accuracy, quoted Augusta Longbottom directly. Augusta had given Skeeter 12 minutes on the record, which was 12 minutes of the most precise and devastating language Amelia had ever heard deployed against another person, and included a statement from the DMLE confirming the investigation was active. It also named Neville Longbottom. Augusta had told him everything the evening after Hogwarts, as she'd promised. Amelia didn't know exactly what that conversation had looked like, but she received an owl from Augusta the following morning that said simply, he took it well. He wants the binding removed as soon as Strout is ready. He also said, and I am quoting him directly, that explains a lot, actually. Make of that what you will. The Prophet hit the Hogwarts breakfast tables on the first day of September, which was a coincidence of timing that Amelia had not planned but that turned out to be, from a certain perspective, perfect. Harry Potter read it over his porridge. He had been at Hogwarts for approximately 6 hours. He had been sorted into Gryffindor, which had surprised no one who'd read a prophecy, and had met Neville Longbottom in the boat crossing the lake, because Neville had lost his toad and Harry had helped look for it in the dark, and they had arrived at the castle with Trevor tucked in Harry's breast pocket and an already established sense of mutual alliance. Harry picked up the Prophet from the pile in the middle of the table and read the headline and went very quiet. The kind of quiet that is not blankness but is the opposite of it, a quiet full of something moving very fast beneath the surface. Neville was 3 seats down, talking to a girl named Hermione Granger who had an opinion about wand movements and was not shy about sharing it. He had his own copy of the Prophet in front of him, open to the article, with his name in it, which should by rights have been the most alarming thing about his first breakfast at school. He was not alarmed. He looked, if anything, like a person who has been told a door was always there and is now simply deciding to open it. "Neville," Harry said. Neville looked up. Harry held up the paper. "This is you." "Yeah," Neville said. "Are you all right?" Neville thought about it. Genuinely thought about it, which was a thing Harry would come to understand was characteristic. Neville didn't answer questions reflexively, he answered them when he had an actual answer. "Yeah," he said again. "I think so. There's a lot going on. But yeah." Harry read the article again. Then he folded the paper very precisely and set it beside his plate. Then he said, very quietly, to no one in particular because the people around him were too new to be trusted yet with specific thoughts, "I wonder if anyone's ever checked me." He didn't say it loudly. The great hall was too full of noise. The sorting had been last night, but the first breakfast had its own energy, the overlap of students who'd been here before and those who were entirely new and the particular clatter of 100 conversations. Nobody near him heard. But Hermione Granger, who had very good hearing and was reading over Neville's shoulder, looked up from the prophet and across the table at Harry with an expression that said she had heard, and that she was filing it away, and that she considered it a question worth asking. The Board of Governors met in emergency session on the 3rd of September in a room at the Ministry of Magic that smelled of furniture polish and institutional anxiety. There were 12 members of the board. Amelia knew 4 of them personally, trusted 2 of them completely, and considered the remaining 8 to be various configurations of uncertain. The meeting had been called at her request and Croker's legal pressure, and the suspension recommendation was on the table in formal writing with 17 pages of supporting documentation. The chairman was a man named Agrippa Foley, old money, measured temperament, the kind of institutional loyalty that was neither corrupt nor brave but was at least reliable in its predictability. He read the recommendation with the careful attention of a man who understood what he was reading and what reading it meant. 3 members of the board tried immediately to table the suspension pending a full review. Croker declined to let them. He was exceptionally good at declining things in ways that were technically unobjectionable while being practically immovable. He quoted 4 pieces of legislation, cited 2 precedents, and referenced one Wiesengemot ruling from 1952 that none of the 3 members had ever heard of, and by the time he was finished the motion to table had been withdrawn. The vote for suspension was 8-4. Hogwarts would require an interim headmaster pending the investigation's resolution. Foley asked if anyone had a suggestion. Amelia, who had spent 3 evenings thinking about this, said, "Professor Minerva McGonagall. She's been deputy headmistress for 15 years and her record is completely clean." Nobody objected to McGonagall. She was, in the particular way of people who do their jobs extremely well and without self-promotion, someone it was almost impossible to argue against. The meeting closed in an hour and 20 minutes. As people filed out, one of the 4 dissenting members, a man named Alastair Bletchley, whose family had a long and productive relationship with Slytherin House, came to stand beside Amelia at the window. "You understand," he said quietly, "that this will not be contained to the investigation." "Good," Amelia said. He blinked. He had expected something else from that, some acknowledgement of political complexity, some sign that she understood the scale of what she was doing. "The destabilization this causes at the institutional level, 7 children had their magic suppressed for years without consent," Amelia said. "The institutional destabilization is not my problem. It's the consequence of the action that created it." She picked up her files. "Have a good evening, Bletchley." She walked out. By the end of the first week the prophet had run 3 follow-up stories. 2 were factual. One was Skeeter at her most Skeeter, a sidebar about Dumbledore's lifestyle, his various titles, the history of his accumulated positions, which managed to make the accumulation sound sinister without technically saying anything that wasn't true. Amelia read it, sighed, and accepted it as the cost of using Skeeter as the vessel for the initial story. The letters section of the prophet ran 62 letters across 4 days. 41 were variations of shock and anger directed at Dumbledore. 9 were defenses of him, eloquent, passionate, citing his war record and his contributions to the defeat of Voldemort and the protection of magical Britain. 7 were addressed to Augusta Longbottom specifically, from families who had their own quiet concerns about their own children and had never known quite what to do with those concerns. 5 were from people who seemed to have missed the point entirely. Augusta read every letter. She answered the 7 from families personally, in her own hand, on Longbottom family stationery. Griselda Marchbanks visited Augusta at home on the Saturday following the article. She arrived with a bottle of good wine and stayed for 3 hours. Amelia received a note afterward from Augusta that said, "Griselda is with us." She said, and I am quoting again because the exact phrasing seems important, "I examined Albus Dumbledore in his NEWTS. He was magnificent. He is also not above this. Nobody is above this. She will prepare her testimony independently." Tiberius Ogden's public statement appeared in the Prophet on Sunday. As a sitting member of the Waisengemot, I will make no comment on the merits of the investigation. However, I can confirm that I have requested an expedited hearing date, as the nature of the findings demands that these matters be addressed without delay. It was the most useful thing a member of the Waisengemot had said in public for several years. Dumbledore's own statement, released through his personal solicitor on the Friday, was brief and characteristically careful. He confirmed the investigation was active and that he was cooperating fully. He said that he had made decisions he believed necessary for the protection of certain children during a period of significant danger, and that he respected the right of those families and the appropriate authorities to review those decisions. He expressed, in formal legal language, his regret for the impact on the families concerned. He did not say he was wrong. Amelia read the statement twice and thought, there it is. Not a denial and not an apology. An explanation. A man who has decided to tell the truth about what he did while holding to his reasons for doing it. That was going to be the argument at the hearing, not I didn't do it but I did it and I will tell you why and you will have to decide whether the why is sufficient. It wasn't sufficient. Nothing was sufficient. But she understood now exactly what kind of hearing this was going to be. McGonagall received the interim headmistress appointment with the particular expression of someone who had expected something like this to land on her desk eventually and had prepared for it privately while publicly expecting it not to. She sent Amelia a short professional note acknowledging the appointment, then sent Augusta a different note that was 3 lines longer and not at all professional in the formal sense, and which Augusta showed Amelia later with the single comment, she knew. Knew what? That something wasn't right. She said she'd noticed, over years, that Dumbledore's decisions were sometimes difficult to follow the reasoning of. That she'd assumed she was missing context. Augusta set the note down. She blames herself for not asking more questions. That's not, no, Augusta agreed. It isn't. But that's what she's doing with it for now. She'll get to the other side of it. She paused. She's formidable, Minerva. Having her in the headmistress's chair while the investigation runs is the best thing that could have happened. Neville's binding removal happened on a Tuesday evening, 8 days into term. Strout came to Hogwarts, McGonagall had approved immediately, without hesitation, and performed the removal in the hospital wing with Madame Pomfrey present as a second medical witness and Augusta sitting in the chair beside the bed, straight-backed and absolutely still, in the way she was still when things mattered enormously. The process took an hour. Strout worked in careful, precise stages. Each binding layer required a different countercharm, applied in sequence, the inner ones most delicate because the foundational layer was nearly a decade old and had integrated with the surrounding magical structures in ways that needed to be carefully unwound rather than simply cancelled. Neville lay on the bed and breathed and said nothing much and watched the ceiling. Halfway through, between the second and third layer, he said, not to anyone in particular, it feels like taking off a coat. A coat you'd had on so long you forgot it was there. Madame Pomfrey made a soft sound that was professionally neutral but not entirely. Augusta's hands, in her lap, pressed together. When Strout completed the final layer there was a moment, brief, almost imperceptible, where the air in the room seemed to shift. Not dramatically. Not the way magic looked in stories, with light and noise and visible spectacle. Just a change in the quality of things, a pressure equalizing, a river finding its proper width. Neville sat up. He looked at his hands. Then he looked at his wand on the bedside table. He picked it up. "You don't need to test it now," Strout said. "Give it a few days to." Neville pointed his wand at the small potted plant on the windowsill, a sad, institutional thing that had probably been on that windowsill for years. It exploded into growth. In about 4 seconds it had sent tendrils up the wall and across the ceiling, bloomed with 4 separate species of flower that had no business being on the same plant, and appeared to have also, somewhere in the middle of all that, produced what looked like a small pineapple. Everyone in the room looked at the ceiling. Neville said, in the tone of someone who had suspected something and had just had the suspicion confirmed rather dramatically. "Yes," said Strout. Madame Pomfrey said, "I'll need to file a facilities report." Augusta looked at the plant on the ceiling and the flowers and the small, inexplicable pineapple, and her face did something that it very rarely did. The composure shifted, not breaking but bending, like a door opening slightly, and through the gap was something that looked like relief so profound it had to be mistaken for almost anything else. She pressed her lips together. She looked at the ceiling. She breathed. "Gran," Neville said. "I'm fine," she said. "Don't fuss. You're crying." "I am not." Madame Pomfrey discovered an urgent need to update some paperwork on the other side of the room. Strout began to pack her equipment with quiet efficiency. Neville looked at Augusta, and Augusta looked at him, and after a moment she stood and crossed to the bed and put her hand on the side of his face in the way that people do when they haven't done it in years because it seemed unnecessary and it suddenly seems very necessary, and she said, "You were never the problem, Neville. Not for one day. Not for 1 minute." He nodded. His eyes were bright. "You are Frank's son," she said. "You are Alice's son. And you are," she stopped, and then, "you are exactly who you were always supposed to be." The pineapple fell off the ceiling and landed on the end of the bed, and Neville laughed, a surprised, genuine, slightly watery laugh, and Augusta let her hand drop and stepped back and was, by the time she turned to Strout, entirely composed again. "Good work, Miriam," she said. "Always," Strout said. Harry Potter found out about it because Neville came back to Gryffindor Tower that night and the plant was still in his hair. "What happened to you?" Harry asked. Neville sat in the armchair by the fire and told him, in the plain, factual way he had, the binding, the removal, the plant, the pineapple. Harry listened without interrupting, which was a skill he had developed at the Dursleys and which turned out to be useful for reasons he hadn't anticipated. When Neville finished, Harry said, "Does it feel different?" "Yeah." Neville thought about it. "Like when you've been in a loud room for a long time and you go outside and the quiet feels almost loud? Like that. But reversed." Harry nodded. He was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking," he said. "About what?" "About whether anyone's ever done the same thing to me." Neville looked at him. "Have you?" "I don't know," Harry said. "I don't know what normal feels like for me. I've never had a baseline." He looked at the fire. "But the article said 7 children. All connected somehow to the war. All with significant magical potential." He paused. "I was connected to the war. The way everyone keeps looking at me, I'm guessing I had significant magical potential." He paused again. "Past tense because I don't know if it's been messed with." Neville was quiet. "I'm going to write to someone," Harry said. "I don't know who yet. Someone who can check." "Augusta would help," Neville said. Gran, I mean. She knows everyone and he searched for the word, she's like a weapon that's also a grandmother. She'll help you. Harry looked at him. Then he almost smiled. A weapon that's also a grandmother. It's accurate, Neville said. Amelia received the letter from Harry Potter on a Thursday morning and sat with it for a long time. It was written in the careful handwriting of a child who'd been taught to be neat more than he'd been taught to express himself, with the vocabulary of someone who read more than he talked. He explained his concern directly. He had read the Prophet article, he had spoken to Neville, he understood that the 7 children Dumbledore had identified as potential targets had included himself, and he wanted to request a formal core assessment. He'd signed it, Harry James Potter, Gryffindor first year. And under that, in what seemed like an afterthought, I don't have a guardian I trust to ask for me. I'm asking myself. I'm 11. I don't know if that's allowed. If it isn't, please tell me what is. She read that last line 3 times. Then she picked up her quill and wrote back. Mr. Potter, your request is completely valid and I will arrange it immediately. You do not need a guardian's permission for a medical assessment if you are making the request yourself. Under the Magical Children's Welfare Act you have the right to request diagnostic examination regardless of age. I will contact Healer Strout today. In the meantime, are you well? Amelia Bones, head of the DMLE. She included, at the bottom P.S., Augusta Longbottom is exactly what her grandson described. Contact her if you need anything before we arrange the assessment. She will help. She sent the letter. Then she sat at her desk and thought about Harry Potter, about a boy who had grown up in a Muggle household, no magical community around him, no framework for any of this, who had read a newspaper article and asked a very quiet, very precise question all by himself. At 11. She thought, Frank and Alice would have been proud of their boy. And somewhere, in the part of her mind that was always tracking connections, always mapping the shape of things, Lily and James would have been proud of theirs too. She reached for the Badger paperweight. She put it down again. She sent a second owl to Strout. We need a 7th assessment. Harry Potter. As soon as possible. I'll explain in person. The political fallout had its own momentum now, which was both useful and alarming. Useful because it meant the investigation had enough public force behind it that individual ministry officials couldn't simply make it go away. The kind of institutional suppression that had buried the Perkins files for years would not work against a story that the entire wizarding world had already read. Alarming because the people who stood to lose from Dumbledore's fall, the ones whose careers, reputations, and institutional positions had been built in his considerable shadow, were not quiet about their opposition. 3 senior Wizengamot members published a joint letter in the Prophet arguing that the investigation was politically motivated. They did not say who had motivated it or why. The letter was precisely worded enough to avoid actionable claims while clearly implying that Amelia was pursuing a personal agenda. She read the letter over breakfast and sent a reply the same morning, through the DMLE's official communications office, that said the investigation was founded on mandatory diagnostic reports filed by a qualified healer, cross-referenced with DMLE archival cases, and that the families of the children concerned had given full consent to its continuation. She said these things in extremely clear language. She invited the 3 members of the Wizengamot to review the evidence file, which was available through the proper channels. None of them reviewed the evidence file. Henry Malcolm Perkins, the former Auror whose initials were on the 2 buried inactive cases, sent a letter to the DMLE legal department requesting to know the scope of the inquiry. Croker intercepted it and replied on Amelia's behalf with a list of questions that Perkins was asked to answer in writing within 7 days. Perkins's solicitor asked for a 30-day extension. Croker gave him 10. Augusta, in the meantime, had been having lunches. This was the word she used for it when she reported to Amelia, lunches, and the understatement was enormous. She had, in the 3 weeks since the article broke, met with Griselda Marchbanks twice, Tiberius Ogden once, for senior members of the wizarding legal community, two journalists who were not Skeeter and were therefore more likely to be trusted by people who had reasons to distrust Skeeter, and one retired Auror who had worked directly under Frank Longbottom and who had, it turned out, always had a nagging feeling about a particular case that had been closed without satisfying resolution in 1983. The retired Auror's name was Gawain Robards, and what he'd been carrying for 8 years was the memory of a child who had been assessed by a ministry healer during a welfare check, not Strout, a different healer, and whose results had been flagged for follow-up and then the flagging had quietly disappeared. He'd assumed it was administrative failure. He now considered it worth re-examining. Augusta brought him to Amelia on a Friday afternoon. Robards was lean, mid-50s, with the quality of people who have been careful for a long time and have become very good at it. He told his story without embellishment. The child in question had been a girl named Ida Reyes, Muggle-born. 2 Auror parents had been killed in a Death Eater attack in 1982. She'd been placed with Muggle relatives. The welfare check had been routine. "Where is she now?" Amelia asked. "I've tried to find out," Robards said. "She'd be about 13. There's nothing in the magical registry, no school enrollment, no wand registration." Amelia and Augusta looked at each other. "She's not at Hogwarts?" Augusta said. "No. And if she has any magical ability, which the original assessment suggested she did, significantly, she should be. Unless," Amelia said slowly, "the suppression was severe enough that she never received a Hogwarts letter because her magic appeared too marginal to register." The room was quiet. "That's possible?" Augusta asked. "If the binding was deep enough," Amelia said. "The Hogwarts enrollment charm is sensitive to magical signatures above a certain threshold. If a child's core is suppressed to the point where they present below that threshold," she stopped. "I need to speak to McGonagall about how the enrollment charm works." Robards said, "There might be others." "Yes," Amelia said. "There might." She looked at the files on her desk. "The number 7 was what Dumbledore gave us. What he knew of." She paused. "What if there were applications he didn't make himself? What if Perkins—" She stopped herself. "Not yet. Not enough evidence yet for that. One step at a time." But the shape of things was getting larger. And the weight of it, the sheer accumulated weight of years of this, was pressing against the surfaces of the investigation from every direction. She looked at Robards. "Can you make a formal statement? On the record?" "Already wrote it on the way here," he said, and put a folded piece of parchment on her desk. She looked at it. Then at Augusta, who was sitting with the particular stillness that meant she had expected this and had brought Robards here because she expected it, and the stillness was what it always was: armor, strategy, controlled fury, love. "Lunches," Amelia said. "Lunches," Augusta agreed. That evening Harry Potter wrote a second letter, this one addressed directly to Augusta Longbottom, because Neville had given him the address and also the advice: just be honest. She prefers it. He was honest. He told her he was worried he'd been suppressed too. He told her about the Dursleys, not all of it, just the shape of it, the way you sketch something you don't fully have words for yet. He told her he'd done magic his whole life but it had always felt, he used the same word Neville had, without knowing Neville had used it, thin. Like hearing through walls. He ended the letter by asking, straightforwardly, if she would help. Augusta read it at the kitchen table that evening, with a cup of tea going cold beside her and Trevor occasionally climbing the side of his tank in the background. She read it twice. Then she wrote back, not a short note, not a formal acknowledgement, but 3 full pages in her sharp, clear handwriting, which was more than she wrote to most adults. She told him she was already on it. She told him Strout would assess him within the fortnight. She told him he had done the right thing by asking. And at the very end, because she had 3 full pages and she'd already said the practical things and there was still some space, she wrote, "The fact that you asked the question, Mr. Potter, at 11 years old, in a new school with no one to guide you, having read one newspaper article, that tells me something important about you. Do not let anyone tell you to wait for permission to understand your own situation. You are entitled to that understanding. It belongs to you. She sealed the letter. She called Reginald the owl, who was elderly and disapproving and entirely reliable. She sent it. Then she sat at the kitchen table for a while, in the quiet house, with the sound of Trevor's occasional tank climbing, and she thought about all of it, the investigation, the hearing coming, the shape of the days ahead. Thought about Dumbledore in his office and the sorrow in him that was genuine and the certainty underneath the sorrow that was also genuine, and how a man could hold both of those things at once without the friction of it destroying him. Thought about 7 children. Possibly more. Thought about a girl named Ida Reyes who might be 13 years old somewhere in England, with Muggle relatives, with no letter, with magic she'd never been taught because someone had decided she was better managed than empowered. She picked up her notebook, the one she'd started 6 years ago, the one with Thursday, July 29th at the top, and opened it to a new page. She wrote the name Ida Reyes at the top and underlined it. Then she picked up her quill again and began making a list of everyone she knew in the Muggle-born liaison networks, because some lunches were going to need to happen sooner rather than later, and the hearing was in 2 weeks, and there was still so much that needed to be found. Outside, the evening was settling into dark. The garden looked silver in the last of the light. The roses on the south wall caught the tail end of the sunset and held it for a moment, vivid, brief, certain, before the dark came in. Augusta wrote until her tea was cold and the garden was gone. Chapter 5, The Testimony. The Wizengamot chamber was older than most of the Ministry of Magic around it. While the rest of the building had been expanded and renovated across centuries of bureaucratic ambition, the chamber had simply been maintained, the same tiered seating, the same dark wood, the same enchanted torches in their iron brackets that had been burning in one form or another since the chamber was first used. The ceiling was vaulted stone. Sound moved in it strangely, gathering and releasing in ways that made whispers carry and silences feel enormous. Amelia had been in this room more times than she could count. She had testified here, prosecuted here, watched verdicts delivered that she agreed with and verdicts delivered that she didn't. She knew the room the way you know any place you've spent years working in, the particular cold of the stone floor, the way the light fell through the high narrow windows in the morning, the specific acoustic quality of the space that made a calm voice carry better than a raised one. She had never brought a case quite like this one. The chamber filled from 7 o'clock in the morning. The Wizengamot members filed into their tiered seats in their plum-colored robes and the particular manner of people who understood they were about to participate in something historically significant and were each processing that understanding differently, some with solemnity, some with visible discomfort, a few with the bright-eyed attention of people who found this sort of thing genuinely exciting and hadn't yet developed the judgment to find that inappropriate. The public gallery was full. This had required a ballot system, more people had requested access than the gallery could hold, and the ballot had been administered by the ministry's events office with the slightly dazed quality of people who had never expected to be running a ballot for a Wizengamot hearing. The names in the gallery represented a cross-section of magical Britain, healers, aurors, journalists, academics, family members of the children concerned, and a significant number of ordinary people who had read the prophet articles and decided that this was something they needed to see for themselves. Rita Skeeter was in the press box with 2 other journalists, her acid-green quill already moving before the session had been called to order. Amelia had looked at her once, briefly, on the way in. Skeeter had given her a small, fierce nod that contained in it an acknowledgement, "I know what this is. I'll do it right." Amelia had nodded back. The families of the 7 children were seated in the reserved section of the gallery to the left of the witness position, a carved wooden chair in the center of the chamber's floor, facing the tiered seating of the Wizengamot. 5 of the 7 families were present. The other 2 had given written consent for their findings to be entered and had chosen not to attend, which was their right and which Amelia respected. Augusta Longbottom sat in the front row of the reserved gallery, spine straight, vulture hat perfectly positioned, hands folded in her lap. Neville was beside her, which had been Augusta's decision and Neville's request, and Amelia had agreed to both the moment she'd heard them. He was in his school robes because he'd come directly from Hogwarts on a Saturday pass that McGonagall had approved without comment. He sat beside his grandmother and looked at the chamber around him with the careful, observant attention that Amelia was beginning to understand was simply how he processed things. Strout was in the witness preparation area off the main chamber, going over her notes with the focused calm of someone who had given expert testimony before and was not troubled by the size of the audience. Croker was at the solicitor's table to the right of the witness chair, his satchel open, documentation arranged with surgical precision. He had the air of a man who had been looking forward to this specifically for the last 3 weeks. Dumbledore sat at a separate table to the left, with his own solicitor, a measured, careful woman named Harkness who had a reputation for managing difficult cases with quiet competence. He was in plain dark robes rather than his usual vivid colors, and his beard was neatly contained, and he looked, Amelia thought, like himself reduced to essentials. The warmth was still there. The magnitude. But stripped of the peripheral brightness, the colored robes, the casual theatrical quality, he looked like something seen clearly for the first time. He sat without apparent distress, without performance, and met the eyes of people who looked at him with the steady, inhabited quality of a man who had decided on his approach and was keeping to it. Griselda Marchbanks, as the senior non-involved member of the Wisengamot, would preside. She was 93 years old, tiny, with white hair pinned back so severely it looked structural, and the specific authority of someone who had been in rooms like this for 70 years and found them entirely manageable. She called the hearing to order with a single knock of her gavel and the chamber settled with impressive speed. Strout testified first. She walked to the witness chair with her case, set it on the floor beside her, and gave her evidence in the precise, methodical way of someone who had prepared to be both technically exhaustive and humanly comprehensible. She knew her audience was mixed, healers and lawyers and Wisengamot members who had varying levels of magical medical knowledge, and she calibrated accordingly. She explained the diagnostic process. She explained what a magical core was and how suppression differed from natural variants. She presented the findings for each of the 7 children in sequence, the depth of suppression, the estimated duration, the layering pattern. She used a visual aid that she'd prepared with McGonagall's charm's assistance, a magical representation of a core scan, projected large enough for the chamber to see, showing the before and after of a bound core versus a free one. The visual was striking. The chamber was very quiet looking at it. She presented Appendix C, the forensic stylistic analysis, with equal clarity. She explained what magical technique attribution meant, how it worked, why it was considered reliable in diagnostic jurisprudence, and she cited 3 previous legal cases in which core forensics had been used as evidence. She did not hedge and she did not embellish. She stated her conclusions and stood by them. When she was finished with the prepared testimony, Harkness rose for cross-examination. The questioning was intelligent and precisely targeted. Harkness focused on the attributional evidence, the methodology matching, and pushed on the question of certainty. Couldn't the binding architecture reflect someone trained by Dumbledore? Couldn't similar methodology be arrived at independently? Wasn't stylistic attribution inherently more subjective than, say, a wand identification? Strout answered each question directly. Yes, theoretical independence was possible. No, in practice the specificity of this architecture made independent development extremely unlikely. The comparison to wand identification was apt, wand cores were empirically tested, methodology attribution relied on documented comparison, which was a different but not lesser standard of evidence. She had provided full documentation of the comparison process in the appendix, which was available to the chamber. She was unshakable. Not because she was aggressive, she wasn't. She simply had the quality of someone who had looked at the facts very carefully and had no anxiety about them because the facts were what they were. Harkness eventually sat down with the careful manner of someone who had done the best she could with what she had. Marchbanks asked 2 questions of her own, brief, specific, medical in nature, that Strout answered in under a minute each. "Thank you, Healer Strout," Marchbanks said. "Your evidence is entered in full." Strout picked up her case and walked back to the gallery with the same measured pace she'd arrived with. She sat beside Augusta. Augusta did not look at her, but her shoulders shifted fractionally, the smallest possible acknowledgement that was also, somehow, complete. Gawain Robards testified second. He covered the buried files, the inactive cases from 1983 and 1986, Perkins's role, the specific language of the filing notations, the investigative follow-up that hadn't happened. He was factual and specific and clearly angry in the contained way of someone who had spent a career managing their anger and was now giving it precise, controlled expression. Harkness cross-examined briefly. The filing inactivity could reflect administrative failure rather than deliberate suppression. Robards agreed it could. He said the pattern of two cases with identical notation by the same reviewing officer, both involving the same diagnostic finding, in the same period, suggested something beyond administrative failure. He also said that Perkins's subsequent appointment to the Board of Governors' advisory position, which had occurred 2 years after his retirement, was a matter of public record that the chamber could weigh as it chose. He stepped down. 3 more witnesses followed, 2 of the consenting parents, giving accounts of their children's apparent magical difficulties over the years, the specific incidents of unexpectedly strong accidental magic, the confusion and self-doubt their children had experienced. One of them, a mother named Celestine Abbott, composed and fierce in the way of people who have had several weeks to process an enormous anger, said, "My son thought he was a squib. He isn't. He's 12 years old and he thought he was a squib, and we spent 5 years trying to encourage him and wondering what we were doing wrong, and what we were doing wrong was believing the world was honest." The chamber was very quiet after that. Then Amelia presented the full DMLE investigative file. This took 40 minutes, because the file was comprehensive and she was not going to allow any element of it to be dismissed for lack of documentation. She covered the timeline, the Perkins inquiry, which had resulted in his withdrawal from the board advisory position and an ongoing separate investigation, and the case of Ida Reyes. Ida Reyes had been found. It had taken 2 weeks and the efforts of Robards, 2 officers from the Muggle-born liaison network, and a Muggle social services worker in Southampton who had been trying to understand why a girl in her caseload could occasionally do things that had no explanation. Ida was 13, living with her maternal aunt, bright and frustrated and convinced she was imagining things. The magical signature she'd been producing had been so suppressed that the Hogwarts enrollment charm had registered her as a squib. She was not a squib. Strout had assessed her. The binding on her core was the deepest of any of the 8 cases, the 8th, because Ida had not been in Dumbledore's list of 7. Either he hadn't known about the application to her case, or he had known and withheld her. Either option required explanation. Amelia presented this evidence and watched the chamber's reaction carefully. The discomfort in the tiered seats had been building incrementally across the morning, but the Ida Reyes case changed the texture of it. This was no longer purely about strategic decisions made in wartime with complicated rationale. A Muggle-born child with dead parents had been suppressed deeply enough to fall off the magical registry entirely. That was harder to frame as protection. She looked at Dumbledore as she presented it. His face was very still. Whatever he was feeling was internal and he was keeping it there, and for the first time across the whole morning his composure had the quality of effort rather than equilibrium. She finished. Marchbanks thanked her. She returned to her seat. "The chamber will hear now from Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore," Marchbanks said, in the same tone she used for everything, which was the tone of someone who considered formality a practical tool rather than a ceremony. Dumbledore rose. He walked to the witness chair without haste and sat in it and looked at the chamber around him, at the tiered faces, the gallery, the press box, without evident unease. He testified in his own voice, which was the voice everyone in the room knew. Even stripped of its usual contexts, the school speech, the public address, the quiet individual conversation over tea, it carried its quality. Warm, precise, unrushed. A voice that had spent 80 years being listened to and had developed, whether consciously or not, the habits of a voice that expected to be heard. He began in 1981. He described the state of magical Britain in the months following Voldemort's apparent defeat, the uncertainty, the Death Eater cells that remained active, the compromised ministry, the prophecy's unresolved implications. He described his reasoning regarding the two children, Harry Potter, in Privet Drive under the blood protection Lily's sacrifice had provided, and Neville, with Augusta, less protected by specific magic and therefore, in his assessment, more vulnerable to targeted action. He described the decision to apply the binding. He described the technique. He did not minimize the technical sophistication of what he'd done. He confirmed, directly and without prompting, that the forensic attribution was accurate. It was his methodology. He had done it. He described the subsequent maintenance, the refreshing of the outer layers, including the application in 1989 following the incident where Neville's magic had broken through. He described the other 6 cases with equal directness. He described his reasoning for each, the specific perceived threat in each case, the calculation he'd made each time. And he described Ida Reyes. He had known about her. He had assessed her situation. He had applied the binding, not personally, which was one element of the case that Amelia had not been fully able to confirm until this moment. He had directed the application, through Elphias Doge, who had visited the family in 1983. He had not been present. He had done it at a distance, which was in some ways worse, because it suggested the coldness of policy rather than the heat of direct decision. "I didn't intend for her to miss Hogwarts," he said. "I intended for her to be overlooked by any remaining elements of the Death Eater network. I miscalculated the depth of effect on the enrollment registration." He paused. "I am aware this explanation is inadequate. I offer it not as justification but as fact." The chamber was very quiet. One of the Wisengamot members, a woman in the middle tier named Gregor Meadows, said, "Headmaster. At any point across these 8 years, did you consider informing the families? Did you consider that they had a right to know what had been done to their children and why?" Dumbledore held her gaze. "Yes," he said. "I considered it. And I concluded that informing them risked the protection I was attempting to provide. That a family who knew their child had been suppressed might, in their distress, seek removal of the binding in a way that would make the child visible again. You concluded," Meadows said carefully, "that your judgment about what they might do was sufficient reason to remove their right to make the choice." A pause. "Yes," Dumbledore said. "That is what I concluded." The quietness that followed had its own weight. It was not the quiet of shock. The chamber had been building to this all morning. It was the quiet of a thing finally stated plainly, with its full implications visible. Another member, and the children themselves? Their experience of growing up believing themselves less capable than they were? "I believed," Dumbledore said, "that a childhood of relative ordinary obscurity was preferable to the alternative risks. I still believe the risks were real." He paused. "I do not believe my assessment of how to manage those risks was correct. I understand now, more fully than I did, what the cost was to those children." He looked at the gallery, at the families, at the reserved section. "I am not able to make that cost disappear by acknowledging it. But I am acknowledging it." He looked then, directly, at Augusta. Augusta looked back at him. Her face did nothing. She did not give him the relief of a reaction. He looked away. Harkness made her formal submissions, the wartime context, the genuine threat, the absence of malicious intent, the full cooperation throughout the investigation. She was thorough and competent, and Amelia respected the quality of her work even while being unmoved by any of it. Croker made submissions for the Longbottom family. He was brief, measured, and absolutely devastating in the specific way of someone who knows they don't need to be theatrical because the facts are doing the work. He cited the Children Protection Act, the specific provisions of Clause 7 which govern deliberate magical interference with a minor's development, and the sentencing guidelines for cases of this nature. He noted that cooperation and genuine remorse were mitigating factors the chamber could consider. He also noted that they were not exculpatory factors, and that the nature of the harm, its duration, its depth, its effect on 8 children's entire experience of their own identity, warranted the chamber's full consideration. Then he sat down and nodded at Augusta. Augusta stood. She had not been scheduled to speak. This was not in the formal proceedings. Marchbanks looked at her, and Augusta looked at Marchbanks, and some silent negotiation occurred that lasted about 4 seconds before Marchbanks said, "Mrs. Longbottom, you may address the chamber." Augusta walked to the center of the chamber floor. She didn't go to the witness chair, she stood beside it, between it and the Wisengamot's tiered seating, so that she was facing them directly. She said, "I am not here to add to the legal record. The legal record is complete. I am here to say one thing that the legal record cannot say, because it is not a legal thing." The chamber was completely still. "My son and his wife are alive," Augusta said. "They are in a long-term ward at St. Mungo's Hospital and they have been there for 10 years and they will be there until they die, because Bellatrix Lestrange and her associates destroyed their minds with a curse designed to cause maximum suffering. I accepted that. I accepted it because the war was real and the choices they made in it were theirs and they would have made the same choices again. I accepted it because there is a version of the world in which sacrifice has meaning." She paused. "What I did not accept, what I was not asked to accept, because I was not asked anything, was that on top of what the war took from them, a man I trusted would also take something from their son." Her voice was level, and the levelness was a choice, and the choice was visible. Frank and Alice's boy grew up believing he had somehow missed the inheritance they left him. That their gift, their strength, their capacity, had passed him by. He was told this by nothing and no one explicitly. He was just shown it, every day, in the gap between what he reached for and what arrived. He spent 11 years thinking the gap was him. She let that sit. "It was not him," she said. "It was never him." And the man who put the gap there made a calculation, a cool, private, unilateral calculation, that the gap was a necessary cost, and that the cost was worth paying, and that he was entitled to pay it on behalf of a child who had no say and a family who had no knowledge. She looked at Dumbledore. "I have heard your reasoning, Albus. I have heard it and I understand it and it does not matter. You do not get to decide what other people's children cost. That is not yours. It was never yours." She turned back to the chamber. "The Wisengamot will make whatever decision it makes," she said. "I trust this body to do that properly, and if it doesn't, I will be back." A very slight pause that had something in it that was not quite a warning and not quite a promise and was entirely credible as both. "What I am asking you to remember, in your deliberation, is not the strategy and not the wartime context and not the question of intent. I am asking you to remember 8 children. Their names are in the file. They are real. They grew up thinking less of themselves because of a choice that was made for them without their knowledge, and the years they spent thinking that are years they will not get back." She held the chamber's attention for one more moment. "That is what accountability means. Not the punishment. The understanding of what was lost." She walked back to her seat and sat down and was composed before she reached it. The chamber was silent for a long moment. Then Marchbanks said, very quietly, "Thank you, Mrs. Longbottom." The deliberation took 2 hours. The families waited in an anteroom off the main corridor, a functional space with benches and bad tea from a ministry urn and the specific quality of waiting that comes when you have done everything you can do and the outcome is now in someone else's hands. Amelia moved between the anteroom and the corridor, checking in with Fletcher, reviewing nothing because there was nothing left to review, accepting a cup of the bad tea because refusing it seemed rude. Augusta sat on a bench with Neville beside her. They weren't talking. They had been talking, apparently, for some time before Amelia arrived. There was the quality of a recently finished conversation in the way they sat together, each settled in their own space, not needing to fill it. Amelia sat across from them. "Are you hungry?" she asked Neville. "I can get someone to find food." "I'm all right," he said. Then, after a moment, "What do you think they'll decide?" "I think," Amelia said, choosing her words with care, "that the evidence is clear, the legal framework is clear, and the chamber has a strong majority of members who understand both. I think there will be a formal censure. I think the suspension from Hogwarts will be made permanent." She paused. "The chief warlock position is gone. That one isn't even a question, you can't hold that role under formal censure." "Will he go to Azkaban?" Neville asked. "No," Amelia said. "The sentence for this offense, with cooperation and no finding of malicious intent, is unlikely to include custodial penalty. He'll have conditions. Restrictions on certain magical practices. Monitoring." She looked at him. Does that matter to you? What the sentence is?" Neville thought about it. "Not really," he said. "I mean, it matters that it's something. But I don't think," he paused, working it out, "I don't think punishing him fixes the thing that's wrong. The thing that's wrong is that it happened. And that's still true regardless of the sentence." Amelia looked at him for a moment. 11 years old, she thought. "Yes," she said. "That's right." "Gran said the same thing," he said. "I imagine she did." Augusta was looking at the wall with the expression she had when she was not looking at the wall but at something else entirely. After a moment she said, without turning, "Strout confirmed the assessment of Harry Potter." Amelia went still. "She sent me the report this morning," Augusta said. "I didn't have time to tell you before the hearing. 2 layers. Shallower than Neville's, the foundational layer was applied later, around 1983, when Harry would have been 3. Same architectural style." She paused. "The second layer matches the first. Consistent application." "Dumbledore," Amelia said. "Yes." A silence. "Does Harry know?" Amelia asked. "Strout told him this morning." Augusta paused. "He said thank you. Then he asked how quickly it could be removed." Amelia sat with that for a moment. "I'll need to add the Potter assessment to the formal record," she said. "The chamber needs to know before they finalize." "I assumed you would," Augusta said. "The report is in the file Strout gave me." She reached into her briefcase, the dragonhide one, always, and produced it. Page 4. Amelia took it. She stood. "I'll be back." She walked to the chamber door, knocked, was admitted by a clerk, walked to Marchbanks and handed her the document and spoke to her for 30 seconds. Marchbanks read it, looked at Amelia, looked at the document again. "I'll bring it to the chamber," she said. Amelia went back to the anteroom. The deliberation extended by another 40 minutes after that. Nobody in the anteroom asked why. When the clerk came to the door and said the chamber was ready, they filed back in, the families, the witnesses, the solicitors. The gallery had remained seated throughout, the audience patient with the specific patience of people who understand that what they're waiting for is worth waiting for. The Wisengamot members were in their seats. Marchbanks was at the presiding position. Dumbledore was at his table, his solicitor beside him. Marchbanks read the finding. Guilty, on 7 counts of deliberate magical interference with a minor's core, the 8, the Potter case, had been admitted to the record but would be subject to a separate supplementary proceeding given the timing. Guilty on 2 counts of directing another person to perform such interference, referencing the Ida Reyes case and Elphias Doja's involvement. Formal censure. Permanent removal from the office of headmaster of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. Immediate removal from the office of Chief Warlock of the Wisengamot. Surrender of the Supreme Mugwump position, referral to the International Confederation. Restricted Practice Order, specific limitations on the application of core-binding magic, monitored for 5 years. Mandatory public statement to the families of all 8 children. No custodial sentence. Marchbanks read the mitigation acknowledged by the Chamber, full cooperation throughout the investigation, genuine engagement with the harm caused, absence of malicious intent as a finding of fact. She noted, in language that was dry and precise and cutting in its precision, that the absence of malicious intent did not diminish the harm, and that the Chamber's acknowledgement of mitigation was not an absolution. She also noted, and this was the element that Amelia had pushed for in the procedural submissions, the one she'd argued longest for, that the Chamber was formally recommending a review of all Ministry of Magic cases closed or filed inactive between 1981 and 1990 in which mandatory reporting of child magical interference had been referred. The review would be independent, overseen by the DMLE. Perkins's cases were the beginning, not the entirety. The gavel came down. The gallery erupted. Not in the way of a crowd that's been told something they didn't expect, in the way of a crowd that's been holding something in for a long time and has just been given the specific relief of a clear verdict. Voices, movement, the sound of a dozen conversations beginning at once. In the reserved section, one of the mothers was crying quietly and her husband had his arm around her and was not. One of the fathers, a man from Aberdeen whose son had spent years being tutored for a capacity he secretly possessed, had his eyes closed. Celestine Abbott was sitting very straight with her hands in her lap, breathing. Augusta did not cry and did not close her eyes and did not change her expression significantly. She looked at the presiding position where Marchbanks was closing the formal record, and then she looked at Neville, and Neville was looking at the Chamber with the expression of someone who has just seen a very large and complicated thing happen and is now, quietly, beginning to work out what it means. "Neville," she said. He looked at her. "It's done," she said. He nodded, slowly. "Not everything," he said. "Ida still hasn't had her letter. And there might be more." "No," Augusta agreed. "Not everything. But this part," he said. "This part," she said. He looked back at the Chamber. At the gallery and the moving Wisengamot members and the press box where Skeeter's quill was going at what appeared to be physical limits, and at the solicitor's table where Croker was packing his satchel with the satisfied air of a man who has done exactly what he came to do. "Gran," he said. "Yes. I want to go back to school," he said. "I want to practice." Augusta looked at him. Something crossed her face, the same thing that had crossed it in the hospital wing when the pineapple fell, the same thing she didn't have a public name for. "Tomorrow," she said. "Tonight we eat a proper dinner." "Where?" "Wherever you like." He thought about it for approximately 3 seconds. "The place with the treacle tart." "The place with the treacle tart," she agreed. Amelia found Dumbledore in the corridor outside the Chamber, alone. Harkness had stepped away to file something. He was standing at one of the corridor's tall windows, looking out at the enchanted atrium ceiling through the glass. The permanent afternoon light. She stood beside him. "The Harry Potter supplementary proceeding," she said. "It'll be in 3 weeks." "I know. He's asked for the binding removal immediately. Strouts agreed to do it this week." "Good," Dumbledore said, and meant it. They stood in silence for a moment. "You understand," Amelia said, "that this is not the end of it. The independent case review, there may be more than Perkins's files. There may be things none of us know about yet." "I know," he said. "Whatever is found, I'll cooperate. You've said that before. And I'll keep saying it," he said, "until there's nothing left to cooperate with." She looked at him. "For what it's worth," she said carefully, "I believe you understood the danger in 1981. I believe it was real. I believe your concern for those children was genuine." He looked at her. "And I believe," she continued, "that you are one of the most intelligent and capable people in this country, and that you have spent so long being that person that you stopped being able to distinguish between knowing better and being better. And that is the most dangerous thing a person in your position can become. He held her gaze. Yes, he said. I know. Good, Amelia said. She picked up her files. I hope the knowing is useful to you. She walked back toward her office, down the corridor that smelled of furniture polish and the particular institutional certainty of a place that had been running a long time, and she did not look back. Behind her, the enchanted ceiling shifted from afternoon to early evening, the light going gold and then amber, warm and artificial and utterly reliable, the ministry's permanent, untroubled sky. She took the stairs. Outside was better. Chapter 6. After October arrived at Hogwarts the way it always did, all at once, as if someone had turned a dial. The warmth of September vanished overnight and the lake went silver and the mountains collected their first cloud cover and the forest went every shade of orange and red and the kind of deep stubborn green that refuses to yield even when everything around it has. Neville noticed all of it. He'd always noticed things that grew. That hadn't changed. What had changed was the quality of what happened when he paid attention, the way the plants in Professor Sprout's greenhouses seemed to register him now, turning fractionally toward him when he walked in, the way the devil's snare in the corner of Greenhouse 3 had, on his second visit, extended one tentative tendril in his direction and then retracted it, as if introducing itself. Professor Sprout had seen it and gone very still and then said nothing at all, which Neville was learning was her highest form of acknowledgement. The magic itself felt different in ways he was still cataloging. Not overwhelming, nothing had become suddenly easy in the way of stories where a curse is lifted and the hero immediately becomes effortlessly perfect. What had changed was the distance between intention and result, which was shorter now, and the ceiling of what was possible, which was higher. He could feel that ceiling without having reached it, the way you can stand in a large room and understand its dimensions without touching every wall. He practiced in the mornings, before breakfast, in an unused classroom on the third floor that he'd found by accident in his second week and had not told anyone about except Harry. He practiced the spells from their classes, Wingardium Leviosa, the basic transfiguration exercises, the color change charm they'd been shown by Flitwick, and worked through them with the methodical attention he'd always applied to things he cared about, except now the application produced results, which was a new experience and one he was, quietly, enjoying enormously. Wingardium Leviosa on a desk chair produced results that were enough of an improvement on the salt shaker incident that he sat on the floor for a moment afterward and just breathed. Harry came in on the third morning to find Neville levitating 4 things simultaneously: chair, inkwell, his own shoe, and Trevor's tank, with Trevor visible through the glass looking philosophically unbothered, and stood in the doorway for a moment before saying, "You know you're not supposed to be able to do that yet." "I know," Neville said. "Is it hard?" "It's not easy. But it's like, you know when you're carrying something heavy and it's difficult but it doesn't feel like it's going to break you?" Harry came in and sat on a desk. He'd been quieter the last 2 weeks, since Sprout's assessment, since the hearing, since the supplementary proceeding had been scheduled. Not troubled exactly, Harry didn't seem to do troubled in any straightforward way. More like a person sitting with something and not having finished sitting with it yet. "Mine's next week," he said. "The removal?" Neville set the 4 objects down gently and retrieved his shoe. "Yeah." He looked at his hands. "Sprout says it's shallower than yours was. Should be quicker." "That's good." "Is it weird?" Harry asked. "Afterward? Did it feel weird?" "Yeah. But good weird." Neville put Trevor's tank on the desk. "Like being cold for a really long time and then being warm, and you suddenly realize how cold you were." Harry nodded. He looked at the window, where the October morning was pressing grey and clean against the glass. "Dumbledore did it when I was 3, he said." "I was 3. He said it without heat, not with the removed calm of someone suppressing something, but with the particular flatness of someone who has passed through the anger and is now in the larger, less convenient territory of understanding." "I know," Neville said. My parents were dead. He'd put me with the Dursleys. He was managing every aspect of my life like, Harry stopped. Like I was a piece in something. Like I was the piece that needed to be kept safe and contained and ready for later use. Neville was quiet. And the worst part, Harry said, is that he wasn't wrong about the danger. That's what gets me. He wasn't wrong that Voldemort's people were still out there. He wasn't wrong that I might be a target. He looked at Neville. He was just completely wrong about having the right to decide what to do about it without telling anyone. Yeah, Neville said. Gran says the same. She says it's the most dangerous kind of wrong, because it has right in it. Harry thought about that. Your Gran is terrifying. I know, Neville said, with audible pride. She wrote to me again, Harry said. What did she say? She said, he pulled a letter from his pocket, worn at the fold from rereading, that I should decide, after the removal, who I want to know about it. That I don't owe anyone my medical history and I don't owe anyone a performance of gratitude for the investigation either. That it's mine to manage. He folded it again. Nobody's ever said anything like that to me before. She means it, Neville said. I know. That's why it's, he stopped and shrugged in the way people do when they have more feelings than words. Anyway, Neville agreed. They went to breakfast. Strout performed Harry's binding removal on a Thursday afternoon in the hospital wing, which was empty of other patients and bright with October light from the high windows. Augusta had come, Harry had asked her to, which Strout had relayed to Augusta, and Augusta had arranged to be at Hogwarts without being asked twice. She sat in the same chair she'd sat in for Neville, in the same posture, with the same folded hands. Harry sat on the bed and looked at the window and breathed. Madame Pomfrey had found something urgent to do on the other side of the ward. The removal took 35 minutes. Shallower than Neville's, as Strout had estimated, but Harry's core was, and Strout did not say this during the removal, she noted it in the report she filed afterward, larger. Significantly larger. Not in the sense that made it simple or controllable. Core size was not a linear measure of anything useful, and raw magnitude without training was just noise, but in the way that made the diagnostic equipment perform an automatic self-check because it wanted to be sure it was reading correctly. It was reading correctly. When she completed the final layer, Harry sat very still for a moment. Then he took his wand from the bed beside him. He'd set it down at the start because Strout had asked him to, and he turned it over in his hands and looked at it. He didn't point it at anything. He just held it. And the air in the hospital wing, very briefly, moved. Not dramatically, no explosion of growth like Neville's pineapple incident, nothing visible or loud. Just a quality change, like pressure equalizing, like a current finding its true speed. The enchanted candles in their brackets all brightened by about 30% simultaneously and then settled. Strout made a note. All right, she said. Yeah, Harry said quietly. Then, it feels enormous. It is what it is, Strout said. It'll take time to understand what it means. Don't rush it. He nodded. He was looking at his hands again, which was, Strout had noticed, what people did after removal, looked at themselves as if checking whether they matched what they now felt inside. Augusta said, from her chair, Harry. He looked at her. You should know, she said, that what you do with this, how you use it, what you become, none of that is owed to anyone. Not to the people who suppressed it, not to the people who freed it, not to a prophecy, not to magical Britain, not to me. She held his gaze directly. It's yours. Do you understand? He looked at her for a long moment. Yes, he said. Good. She stood and picked up her bag. I'll see you at Christmas, if you'd like to visit. He blinked. I can do that. I'm inviting you, she said, with the slight impatience of someone for whom the statement should have been self-evident. So yes. He nodded, still looking slightly dazed, and then something shifted in his face, the dazed quality giving way to something simpler and much younger. "Yeah," he said. "I'd really like that." "Good," Augusta said. "Neville will be pleased." She looked at Strout. "Thank you, Miriam." Again. "Stop thanking me," Strout said mildly. "I'm just doing my job." "You're doing it exceptionally," Augusta said. "There's a difference." She left. Strout finished her notes. Harry sat on the hospital bed for a while, turning his wand over in his hands, getting used to himself. The independent case review that the Wiesengemot had ordered began in November. Amelia ran it, as she'd been appointed to do, with Robards as her senior investigator and a team of 4 Aurors she trusted and had personally cleared of any historical connection to Perkins or the cases in question. In the first month they found 2 more inactive filings from the 1981 to 1990 period. Neither bore Perkins's initials, which opened its own set of questions. One was administratively traceable to a simple backlog failure, a genuine, uncoordinated absence of follow-through that appeared to be exactly what it claimed to be. The other was less clear. They set that one aside and kept digging. Henry Perkins gave his formal statement to Robards on a grey November morning. He was in his mid-60s, silver-haired, with the quality of someone who had been rehearsing this conversation in his head for weeks. He confirmed that in both inactive cases, he had received verbal guidance from a senior official to treat the findings as inconclusive. He would not initially give the name of that official. After 40 minutes of Robards being extremely patient and Croker's legal documentation being extremely present, he gave the name. It was not Dumbledore. It was a currently serving ministry official named Barnabas Cuff, who was the editor of the Daily Prophet, a fact that took Amelia a moment to process, because the layers of irony involved in the Prophet's role in the current investigation were almost too many to catalogue, and who, it turned out, had received the guidance in turn from a source he was also initially reluctant to name. That source was Cornelius Fudge, who had in 1983 been a junior official in the Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes and who had since risen significantly. Amelia sat with that particular piece of information for an afternoon. Then she sent 2 owls, one to Cuff's legal representative and one to Fudge's office, and began building a secondary file. This was going to take longer than the primary investigation. She had known, from the beginning, that this would be the shape of it, not one culpable party but a network of small decisions made by people who hadn't fully understood what they were participating in, or had understood and chosen convenience. Dumbledore had been at the center of it, but centers don't exist without surrounding structures, and the surrounding structures had their own accountabilities. She was not in a hurry. She was, if anything, more settled in her work now than she'd been in years. The investigation had a clear North Star, the truth, whatever it was, documented properly and pursued to wherever it went. That was a North Star she could navigate by indefinitely. She went home at a reasonable hour, for the first time in weeks, and ate dinner, and did not bring files. The Prophet story that ran the week after Perkins's statement broke was not Skeeter's. Skeeter had, to her considerable credit and Amelia's genuine surprise, declined to run it on the grounds that it was still under active investigation and she didn't want to compromise the case. She told Amelia this over a brief and entirely businesslike coffee and added, "I have standards, Bones. They're just very particular standards." The story ran in the Quibbler first, under a headline that was slightly unhinged in its formatting but contained only entirely accurate information, and was then picked up by the Prophet's news desk who ran it with appropriate caveats. The Fudge element was not named, Amelia had been clear about that, and the journalists had respected it. The Cuff element was. Cuff resigned from the Prophet's editorship by the end of the week, citing personal reasons. The new editor's first act was to publish a formal correction to the Prophet's coverage of the Lestrange trial from 1982, noting that certain elements had been mischaracterized in ways that, in retrospect, had served particular institutional interests. It was the smallest possible version of an apology, but it was something. Ida Reyes came to Hogwarts in January. McGonagall had arranged everything, the late enrollment, the ministry approval, the accelerated introductory program to bring her up to speed on the theory her peers had been absorbing since September. The enrollment charm, once her binding had been removed by Stroud in October, had registered her immediately and loudly. McGonagall had sent the letter the next day. Ida had, by all accounts, read it 17 times. She arrived on a Tuesday, which Augusta had always considered an unremarkable day for remarkable things. She was 13 years old, tall for her age, with close-cropped hair and the particular way of moving that people develop when they've spent years convincing themselves not to take up too much space. She carried a new wand, 9 3/4 inches, blackthorn, dragon heartstring, which Ollivander had described as demanding but fair, and a trunk that her aunt had helped her pack, and an expression that was trying to be composed and wasn't quite managing it. McGonagall met her at the entrance and walked her through the castle herself, which she did not do for every student and which Ida would later say was one of the first times she understood that what had happened to her was being taken seriously. The Sorting Hat spent 4 minutes on her head, which was longer than usual. When it called out Gryffindor, the house table erupted, not because they knew her story but because the Hat's deliberation had made them curious, and curiosity at a long sorting usually resolves in enthusiasm. She sat at the Gryffindor table between a third year who introduced herself immediately and a fourth year who passed the bread without being asked. Across the table, 2 first years who had been following the investigation in the Prophet since September looked at her with careful, unintrusive awareness. Neville caught her eye and said, simply, "It gets easier. The magic, I mean. Quicker than you think." She looked at him. "You're Neville Longbottom." "Yeah." "The article." "Yeah." She looked at him for a moment longer. "Does it actually get easier?" "Yeah," he said. "It really does." She looked down at her plate. Something in her face shifted, the careful composure softening around the edges, not breaking but changing quality, the way ice changes quality in the first hour of a thaw. She picked up her fork. "Good," she said. Augusta planted a rose bush on a Saturday in early November. She did it alone, in the garden, in the specific cold of a morning that had decided to be honest about being November. She'd bought the bush from a wizarding nursery in Derbyshire, a variety called Longbottom's Memory, which was coincidence but felt like something else, and she planted it in the south-facing bed against the wall where the light was best. She did it herself, without magic, which took longer and made her knees ache but felt necessary. She didn't explain it to anyone. Neville would be home at Christmas and would see it then and probably understand more than she'd said, which was appropriate. He was good at that. She stood up when she was done, brushed her hands on her gardening apron, and looked at the small bare canes against the stone wall. Come spring they would do something. She had a provisional trust in that. She went inside and made tea and sat at the kitchen table with Trevor's tank beside her and her notebook open in front of her. She had started a new section in October, separate from the 6 years of suspicion and evidence gathering, the timeline and the names and the documented pattern. This section was different. She hadn't found a precise heading for it. The page at the top just said, "What comes after?" She had written a few things under it already. Ida Reyes's name, after Stroud confirmed the removal. The date of Harry's assessment and removal. Notes from her conversations with the families of the other children, how they were doing, what they'd said, what they needed. A note about the secondary investigation, which Amelia had briefed her on with the professional directness Amelia applied to everything, and which would go where it went. A note about the case review and its likely trajectory, which was going to be long and complicated and surface things that nobody was fully ready for. She added, "Rose bush planted." Then she looked at it and thought that was insufficient and wrote, "For Frank and Alice." For all of them. She closed the notebook. Outside the garden was bare and November cold and entirely unpromising. Inside it was warm and the tea was good and Trevor was climbing his tank in his meditative way, and the house had the particular quality of a house that has absorbed a great deal of history and has opinions about it. Augusta drank her tea and let herself be still for a little while. This was harder than it seemed, she was not a naturally still person, she was a person with forward momentum and a comprehensive list of things to do, but she had learned, over the last months, that there was a specific quality of stillness that came after something significant, and that it was not the same as stopping. It was more like a breath between one movement and the next. She thought about the hearing. About standing in the center of the chamber and saying what needed to be said. About the gavel coming down. About Neville sitting beside her and saying not everything, but this part. She thought about Dumbledore. She found, to her mild surprise, that what she felt about him was not simple. She had said in the chamber that she didn't forgive him, and that was true. But it was true in the way of things that are true and also not the whole of anything. She could hold the absence of forgiveness and also hold the understanding that he was a human being of extraordinary capability and catastrophic certainty, and that both of those things had shaped the world in ways that couldn't be cleanly separated into good and bad. She did not need to forgive him to understand him. She did not need to feel sympathy to find him legible. What she needed, and what she had, was the simple clarity of having done what was right. She had seen something wrong and she had moved toward it, not away from it, and she had done it not because she was brave in any abstract sense but because the alternative was not tolerable. She was not constituted for looking away. It was not, strictly speaking, a virtue. It was just how she was made. She finished her tea. She picked up her quill. She opened the notebook to the new section and started a new list, families to follow up with, a letter she needed to write to Griselda about the Wisengamot's proposed new oversight framework for mandatory reporting cases, a meeting she'd agreed to with a journalist from the Quibbler who was writing a long piece on magical children's rights and wanted her perspective. The list grew quickly, because it always did. There was always more to do. This had always been true and it would always be true, and Augusta had long since made her peace with it. She wrote until the tea was cold and the light through the kitchen window had moved from morning to midday, and then she put on her coat and her hat and went to buy groceries, because Neville was coming home at Christmas and the house needed to be stocked with the things he liked, and some things were simply the work of being alive and they were not lesser for being ordinary. In December, Neville came home for the holidays. He arrived at King's Cross with Trevor in his pocket and a new quality about him that Augusta had been expecting and was still struck by. The same boy, recognizably, completely, but moving in himself differently. The way people move when they have stopped bracing against something. He came through the barrier and found her waiting on the platform. She always waited on the platform, had from the beginning, and would until she physically couldn't, and he came to her with the long-strided walk he developed in the last months, which was the walk of someone who had recently discovered they had more room than they'd thought. "Gran," he said. "Neville." She looked at him. "You've grown." 2 inches, Madame Pomfrey measured. "I believe it." She looked at him for another moment, with the comprehensive attention she always gave him at arrivals and departures. "You look well." "I feel well," he said, and meant it. They collected his trunk and walked to the apparition point. On the way he told her about the term, the classes, the way her biology felt now, an incident with a charms practical that he described with the rueful good humor of someone who'd caused an unexpected explosion and found it genuinely funny in retrospect. He told her about Ida's arrival in January, that he'd written to her and she'd written back and they'd started a correspondence around her biology, which was apparently one of the subjects she'd been reading about obsessively in her self-education before Hogwarts. He told her about Harry. "He's doing well," Neville said. "He's, a lot. Like, there's a lot of him, now. Not in a bad way. Just, he thought, it's like when you tune a radio and suddenly the signal is clear. He's been clearer since the removal. More himself." "What is he like?" Augusta asked. She had formed her own impressions of Harry Potter through letters and one hospital wing afternoon, but she was curious about Neville's. Neville thought seriously about it. "Funny," he said finally. "Genuinely funny, which surprises people because he doesn't look funny. Smart. He's stubborn in this very quiet way where you don't notice it's happening until it's already happened." A pause. "He's kind. Like it's a decision he's made and he's sticking to it. Augusta nodded. He asked me, Neville said, what it was like to have you for a grandmother. What did you tell him? Neville looked at her sideways. I told him it was like being raised by something between a force of nature and a military general who also had opinions about gardening. Augusta was quiet for a moment. That is, she said, extremely accurate. Neville grinned. He said he was looking forward to Christmas. Good, she said. I've made up the spare room. At home, Neville dumped his trunk in the hall and immediately went to the garden, because he always went to the garden. It was the first thing he did. Augusta stood at the kitchen window and watched him go out and then stop when he saw the south wall. He stood at the rose bush for a long time, looking at it. The bare canes against the stone, the small card she'd put on a stake in the soil beside it with the name of the variety in her handwriting. He crouched and looked at it more closely, the way he looked at plants, with genuine attention, the specific curiosity of someone who knew how things grew and therefore understood what they promised. He stayed there for a while. When he came back inside, his eyes were bright but his face was settled, and he said, "It'll flower in June. Maybe late May if the spring is warm." "I expect so," Augusta said. "Frank and Alice," he said. "Yes," she said. He nodded. He went to take off his coat and put the kettle on, and they moved around the kitchen in the familiar way of people who have shared a space long enough to have a choreography, and neither of them said anything more about it, because some things don't need more said. Amelia had her own particular December. The secondary investigation, Cuff, and the source behind Cuff, required careful, documented, absolutely procedurally impeccable work, because the political pressure on this one was significantly greater than it had been on the Dumbledore case. Dumbledore had cooperated and had no political machine running interference for him. The source behind Cuff had considerably more apparatus available. She did the work. She did it the same way she always did it, carefully, completely, with full documentation and no shortcuts, and she did not let the pressure change the pace. She had learned, in 23 years, that the most powerful thing you could do in the face of institutional resistance was simply to refuse to be hurried or deterred, and to keep the paperwork immaculate, because institutions could survive almost anything except a paper trail that was correct. Fletcher brought her coffee. She drank it while it was hot. She went home at reasonable hours. She sent Augusta a note the week before Christmas that said, "The secondary investigation is progressing. Slow, but solid. More to follow in the new year. Amelia." Augusta wrote back, "I expected slow. Slow is fine. Thorough is what matters. Thank you. Enjoy your Christmas. Augusta." At the bottom of the note, in what appeared to be a postscript added after some consideration, Neville says Harry speaks well of you. "So do I." Amelia read that at her desk on a Friday afternoon and was, briefly and privately, glad. On the last day of term before Christmas, Neville sat in the unused third-floor classroom with Harry and Trevor, and the specific afternoon quality of an empty school, which was a particular kind of quiet that had the whole year in it. They'd been practicing. Harry had been working through the more complex transfiguration exercises from the textbook. The ones Hermione had pointed out were technically fourth-year level, with the methodical determination that Neville had come to recognize as Harry's signature mode. Neville had been doing herbology-adjacent magic, which was not technically a formal discipline yet but which Professor Sprout had started to think of as one after the third greenhouse incident. They were sitting on the floor with their backs against the wall and Trevor between them in his tank, which had become his customary attendance at these sessions. "What's your gran giving you for Christmas?" Harry asked. "No idea. She never tells me. She just produces things." Neville thought about it. Last year it was a really good herbology reference book and a set of dragonhide gloves and a lecture about posture. Harry almost smiled. "That sounds right." "What are you?" Neville stopped. He remembered, then. "The Dursleys. Christmas at the Dursleys." "Not going back there," Harry said, reading the pause. I wrote to Mrs. Weasley, Ron's mum, she invited me. Or I could stay at Hogwarts. He was quiet for a moment. Augusta said I could come to you. You can, Neville said. There's room. Gran's already stocked the kitchen. I know, Harry said. She told me. In 3 letters. She's thorough. Yeah. He looked at the ceiling. I think I'll go to the Weasleys this year. Just because, they're a big family, and it's Christmas, and I've never really, he stopped. Started again. I've never had a loud Christmas. You should definitely go, Neville said. Next year, maybe. Yeah, Harry said. Next year. Trevor climbed the side of the tank. Neville, Harry said. Yeah. Do you think it would have been different? If none of this had happened, the binding, the investigation, all of it. If we'd just come to Hogwarts normally. Neville thought about it. We'd have come to Hogwarts, he said. I'd have been rubbish at everything and eventually worked out some of it. You'd have been, I don't know. A lot, still, probably. The binding wasn't everything about you. No, Harry agreed. But it's different now, Neville said. I'm different. Not just the magic. Just, knowing. Knowing what it was. Knowing it wasn't me. He thought about it more carefully. There's something about knowing the truth of your own story that, I don't know. It makes you stand differently. Harry looked at him. Yeah, he said. It does. Outside the window the December sky was closing down early, the light going fast, the grounds going dark. From somewhere below them they could hear the faint distant noise of other students, laughter, running feet, the particular acoustics of several hundred children in a large building approaching the end of term. We should get dinner, Neville said. Yeah, Harry said. He stood and picked up his wand from the floor beside him. Neville. Yeah. Thanks, Harry said. Not for anything specific. For all of it. Neville stood. Come on, he said. Before Ron eats all the good stuff. They left the classroom together, the door swinging shut behind them, Trevor's tank floating gently behind Neville at about shoulder height, which was a thing Neville did now without appearing to notice he was doing it. Somewhere in the wreckage of a great man's reputation, in the slow and patient work of an investigation that would take another 2 years to reach its full extent, in the greenhouse at Hogwarts where a boy who had spent 11 years thinking he was ordinary was now doing things that made Professor Sprout's professional composure genuinely unreliable. In a south-facing garden bed in a house in the West Country where bare canes waited with the particular patience of growing things for the spring. Something honest was at work. Not a resolution. Not a simple reversal where everything suppressed became everything free and everything damaged became everything healed. Just the slow, stubborn, reliable work of truth moving through a system that had tried to contain it, and finding, as truth tends to find, the places where the walls weren't quite solid. Augusta Longbottom was in her garden in the early morning, which was where she often was in December if the weather permitted, just standing, in her coat and her excellent boots, with a cup of tea, looking at the rose bush against the south wall. It was not beautiful yet. It was a collection of sticks in cold ground, and the January ahead was going to test it, and February was not going to be kind, and the spring was still months away. But she had planted it in good soil and in the right light and with the intention behind it that good things require, and she had faith in its general trajectory. She drank her tea. She did not explain why she was smiling. She went inside when her tea was done, and picked up her notebook, and started on the day's list. There was always more to do.